Hello, everybody. I see everyone's doing well. Having all this camaraderie in the chat fills my heart with something positive. I can't think of a word right now. But anyway, yeah, we are going to watch this video, and unless someone recommends another Acer video, I probably won't cover him again. So you can rest easy, because unless he has something to say about Dark Souls again, I'm probably done with him. I was thinking about doing his Elden Ring video, but after request, I've removed that from my list to watch later on just because I don't think I could handle it. Do not recommend an Acer. I'm just going to leave that up as a reminder. But, you know, just, yeah, just his takes are just not very, they're sort of, they're interesting to talk about from a perspective of questioning what the hell he's actually talking about most of the time. Whereas Joseph Anderson actually talks about like mechanical things that are interesting to like they're interesting to discuss, even if Joe is just super, super wrong, you know? I'm obsessed with seeing Radon's grab one shot you. It is actually peak Elden Ring LeMayo. It really is. It really is. It really is. But yeah. Before we get into this video, a couple of little things I wanted to mention. I am working on a Discord for the channel, and I'm thinking about breaking it down sort of by all the different sub channels I've sort of got. So I'm working on that. It's not really up and running yet. I'm trying to map it out before I start making it and putting it together, just because I've never done it. But I am working on that. I'm also working on sort of getting through some sort of going through the list of the videos that I would like to react to at this point. The list is getting rather short. Basically, I've got this video, another Elden Ring review by, I think Synthetic Man was his name, and then I've got a video going over Aragorn's masculinity in Lord of the Rings. That's kind of an unaired pilot that a friend and I recorded for a stream that we never started. But I'd like to react to that. It's a nice short video. Won't be this feature-length film that we're reacting to. But that's something once I get through those sort of videos, I'm kind of out of things that are recommended to me to react to. But I also thought that in light of sort of my Dark Souls 2 commentary kind of turning 4 this this December, I thought we might react to that a little bit too once I sort of run out of other things to react to. I also plan to play Sekiro, so that'll be painfully fun, I hope. We'll see how that goes. But again, just to recap again, I'm working on Discord. We're about out of videos that I've got on my list right now, and we're going to play Sekiro at some point. So look out for those in the future, and leave recommendations for other videos you want in the comments. I do read those, and I try to keep track of them. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to keep track of them. And once the Discord is up, it will have a place to recommend videos to react to, or just other shit. So we'll see how that goes. Yeah. Okay, let me catch up with chat for a second. On a lighter note, though, I've actually been granted a meme from my friend group, Overshadows DLC. I've pretty much developed a track record of running straight to Mesmer without fighting any bosses and then abandoning the DLC after I win. I mean, that's a pretty... That's a goal I can understand. Are you able to actually run past everybody to get to Mesmer, or do you have to fight that one boss with the magic and fire that's like in the as like the transition boss? Do you have to actually fight her to... I always forget if it's Rolana or Renala. I just get them confused at this point. There's too many George R. R. Martinisms like in these damn like naming conventions. There's so many names that just sound so damn similar. It gets confusing. You can run past everyone, including Rolana. Okay, that's cool. I need to keep that in mind when I go through the DLC. One other minor thing, I'm still working on that Elden Ring video where I'm going to go through the game talking about sort of the best and worst aspects of it. Even the golden hippo can be skipped. Yes. All right, but I am still working on that Elden Ring video, but right now I'm like 25% through the Elden Ring video I'm working on in terms of recording stuff, because I've finished the game with 2 tank runs. So the tank runs are done. Right now I'm going through sorcery. So that'll be fun. But anyway, let's get into this video because it's going to be interesting to hear it. And before even actually watching the video, I saw like a description of it, and it basically just said like both Dark Souls 4 and Witcher 4, which I thought was a weird sort of thing to say. Now, granted, I've played a lot of Dark Souls, not played a lot of The Witcher, but I am getting to it. I have it. I promise I will get to it at some point. But let's see how this goes, because I have no idea what his I have no idea what his opinions are going into this. So I guess we'll see how it goes. Your tank build with Taish actually mulched the DLC. I'm so mad at you and myself because I would have enjoyed it more using all my tools. Yeah. Well, it's the weird thing is like Elden Ring's really. This is just kind of a minor thing before we get into the video. Elden Ring's really sort of harsh to tank builds until like halfway through the base game, and then it actually starts getting pretty good. Like once you've got some levels and you've got a couple of good shields and you've got like the talisman that increases your block and all that shit. You've actually been able to sort of level up to meet the challenge by that point. But early game really sucks. But it does help with late game shit. It's just one of those things where the base Elden Ring doesn't really do a lot for tank builds, especially when you get to like the harder bosses like Melania and stuff like that. But the DLC bosses were actually a lot easier with a tank build in my experience. So you'll see that when I get to my video. But anyway, speaking of videos, let's start this one.
So in this game, your Geralt has the title of Tarnished. His roach is now named Torrent, but you still kill monsters. You're also maidenless because Yennefer sure as hell ain't no maiden. Elden Ring is open world Dark Souls. It's the latest game by From Software, and it's a smash hit. Everyone seems to love it, including me. It'll go down in history as one of the greatest games ever made. Every open world game from now on will be compared to this, just like Breath of the Wild before it. And the "it's like Dark Souls" comments have now entered an insane surprise phase 2 of power level with the addition of Elden Ring's triumph. But
kind of talking about his point there, I mean, it is kind of a thing where when you have the big, like people always say, it's like blank whenever you sort of compare something that redefined a genre or was a massive linguistic, not linguistic, but like the reason people started saying it's like Dark Souls was because Dark Souls sort of redefined fair but challenging combat for a lot of people because it had a wide reach, right? Similarly to how Elden Ring is sort of being compared as sort of the modern Dark Souls, right? Like Dark Souls was basically the 2000 teens, difficult but fair sort of benchmark for what a lot of games compare themselves to. It's also because it's a phenomenal game. Elden Ring has received kind of a similar status because it's had a much farther reach than Dark Souls, but it also caps off on all the things that the franchise has sort of experimented with up to this point, which includes very intricate level design, large open worlds that let you sort of choose your pathway through it, difficulty, obviously, and then dynamic bosses and things like that, right? And Elden Ring is sort of Elden Ring, I think, is peak normie From Software in current day because of the way the developers have made the game work. Like the overworld is really sort of easy to deal with for the most part, and so normies can get into that and get used to the mechanics. But then the more hardcore players will go for the bigger things, right? Like the bosses around the place, the more intricate levels that are like actual like places, not just open areas, like castles and crypts and caves and all that shit, right? So this has kind of taken what Dark Souls did for the genre at that time and kind of kicked it up to 11 and because of the sales of Elden Ring, which, as far as I know, I think have eclipsed 25 million copies sold at this point. Elden Ring has a huge reach, so it kind of has become the Dark Souls of the 2020s, right? In that sort of same sense as Dark Souls 1 was kind of that type of thing for the 2000 teens. This is sort of the benchmark to put things against. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with using this as a benchmark. That's one thing that I would disagree on. Is I think a lot of things that Dark Souls got right, Elden Ring got wrong, and I will go over that as we go through this video, I'm sure. But anyway, let's see what his points are in terms of why it is a shattered masterpiece.
But the game also sucks. It has gigantic issues, and I don't have to worry about sugarcoating the introductions of these things anymore because YouTube removed the dislike button. So all you can do is leave comments disagreeing, which only makes this video get pushed to more people. I'm like the final optional boss of the game over here. If you try to block me, you can only make me stronger. You did get to that fight, right? Because if not, if you're only halfway through, then perhaps you don't understand how I can say that a game this astoundingly impressive can suck. Believe me, though,
this is one of those things where he's using the back and forth language so much that annoys me, where it's just like, oh, the game's great, but the game also sucks. It's like, you've basically told me nothing at this point. Now, granted, we are a minute into an hour and 40-minute video, basically, but it's still kind of this thing where he's kind of talking, and it's kind of a vapid nothing thing to bring up. Like if I was going to say it, I would say that Elden Ring is From Software's biggest mixed bag, right? Because you can kind of infer from the way I use those words that there's a lot of things that I like and a lot of things I dislike, right? Which I think is fair. Like whenever you use the two extreme phases of it's great and it sucks in the same sort of like point, you're not doing a good job of explaining what's wrong with it or where you stand on it. You basically just threw out two buzzwords, and now people are going to react to that and think and wonder what you're thinking, like me right now. That's a warning, boys. It means he has some burning hot takes and we would do well to turn back now. Well, we'll see. We'll see what they are. And this is one thing, too, is these aren't... this is not the DLC. This does not include DLC stuff. I don't know if Joseph Anderson's made a video on the DLC. I'm sure he has, but we might cover that in the future. I don't know. But let's get through this one. If he breaks my brain by the end of this video, then I'm probably not going to review his... I'm not going to review his review of the DLC.
It does. I have more issues with this game than any other FromSoft has released in this spiritual series of theirs, yes, including Dark Souls 2. Yet I can't lie and have to state equally plainly that Elden Ring has some of the best moments I've ever had in a game. Sekiro is still my favorite over all of these, but...
Elden Ring had the best experience of... I think he meant to say something else, but just his wording there was a little weird. Also, I think I've heard that Sekiro is sort of the peak of what their like combat design is like when it's at its peak, from what I've heard. Like, it really pushes the difficult fair but accurate to kind of its extreme, and then Elden Ring kind of tips over the line. This is what I've heard from people who have played all the games, including Sekiro. I'm kind of in the outlier where I've played pretty much everything from Demon Souls to now except Sekiro, so I'm kind of out of it. Am I the only one who hates how everyone is using Masterpiece on YouTube for every game considered decent or more? No, you are definitely not alone. I am amongst those people of, this is one reason why I title my commentaries and stuff just commentary, right? Because I don't think you can label, like, very few games are actual masterpieces, right? And the definition of masterpiece gets thrown around a lot when you basically just like something a lot. Like, for instance, a lot of people call Dark Souls 1 a masterpiece. I would not call it a masterpiece. I think it's a fantastic game, but it is not a masterpiece, right? There are significant problems in Dark Souls 1. There are significant problems in all their games for different reasons. Like, they are not masterpieces, right? The idea of a masterpiece is something that works on every level all the time and doesn't have, to me at least, any glaring issues, right? Like, glaring issues in Dark Souls 1 include wow, I'm blanking on it right now. I'm really blanking on it right now. Bed of Chaos fight is massively unfair in the way you can die in that fight. The whole bits of, or not the whole bit, but like the second half of Tomb of the Giants with the skeletons on the floor, those enemies do absurd amounts of damage, per their level, and are very difficult to sort of get past and read without trading significant damage, right? And there are technical issues in Dark Souls as well, where some things don't work the way they really should. Like for example, like parrying on stairs is stuff that doesn't work very well. It's kind of a 50-50 if you get sort of the window open, and there are problems with how punishing certain things in Dark Souls 1 can be. For example, curses are like a big one, right? Like you can get cursed fairly often in the game, and you'll have a really hard time of getting out of that curse, right? Because the curses usually require a very specific item to cure them, which halves your health, which is ridiculous, especially if you're on like a lower level, right? Because you need all the help you can get that early on in the game. Like there are problems in all the games. Just people throw Masterpiece because it's one of those things that sort of gets people clicking on it. Like with this video here, right? Elden Ring, a shattered masterpiece, right? He very intentionally named it that way because a shattered masterpiece sends conflicting messages to people, and so there's intrigue there, and they want to ask, like, what do you mean? Like a shattered masterpiece, basically saying that it's great with the masterpiece, but it has problems with shattered, right? But he's using the most buzzwordiest of buzzwords to get that across. And like you said later, it's just a buzzword at this point. And I think it's bad to put that sort of connotation in your video that early from the title alone. Like I prefer to do it where it's a very neutral sort of, this is a commentary and analysis of X game. And I try to stick it to that, or for my like remembering series, when I did the Transformers video, it's like remembering film, there's no positive or negative connotation to it. Right now, the Elden Ring video is going to be a bit of a one-off because it will be the top 5 and top 5 best and worst things, but it's one of those things where it's I'm still trying to kind of take it from a neutral perspective as opposed to just throwing in buzzwords. I heard that he did cover the DLC and actually liked the bosses, which was strange considering they double down on things he dislikes. I mean, it could also be a thing where this review came out like... Actually, when did this review come out? What date? This came out in April 2022, so he had about 2 months to play the game, because I think it came out in February of that year, right? Like he basically made this video 2 months after the game came out, right? So a lot of things probably weren't patched yet. A lot of things weren't rebalanced. A lot of things were probably very different from what they are now. And also, he's probably had a lot of time to sort of play the game and get good, as it were. Like there are plenty of times where, I've gone into a game initially and had one opinion, and then over time it's changed, right? So I wouldn't really blame his opinion for changing after that. But it is a thing where, some people's opinions change slightly, but they don't come across as slightly. They come across as a bigger change, than the way they word them kind of affects that too. Flawed masterpiece pisses me off a lot. It's so cringe. Yeah, I'm just tired of seeing it all over the damn place. Like you can go to like certain, like one thing I hated about H Bomber guy and his videos when Mahler kind of like went over how he can make some good videos and some bad ones, is all of his titles for like a certain period of time, like several months or years even, were just the same shit over and over. Is like, blank is a genius, and here's blank is genius, and here's why. Blank is awful, and here's why. Right? Like those kind of things are just such vapid nothingnesses as titles that I get kind of bored seeing them. And I'm kind of, and the problem is that people will click on that because it either enforces their bias or they want to argue to the contrary of what the title says. Right? That's something that might not help my videos in the algorithm, but at the same time, I would like to approach this neutrally going in, or to the best of my ability, go in neutral, because I mean, in all honesty, it's very hard to go into something completely neutrally without having some predisposed opinion on it. You know, it's very hard to get a truly neutral perspective, but you can try. You can do your best and try. But anyway, let's get back to this video.
But when it comes to exploration and uncovering the secrets of a world, Elden Ring is the king. So
I would agree with that. Exploring in Elden Ring is probably the best exploring you're probably going to get from Software up to this point. Also because there's just a metric fuck ton of content just in Elden Ring compared to everything else. Like, there's probably more content in Elden Ring than the Dark Souls trilogy put together. Now if we account for repeated assets, that scale would obviously change. But in terms of sheer content wise, Elden Ring definitely has a lot of stuff in it.
pretty messy thoughts, right? Kind of like the game itself. It's an experience of extremes. The highs are so high that I don't think From will ever top them, and the lows are so low that I'm not even excited for the next game they make like this anymore. The trouble that crops up in the last third of Elden Ring is so jarring that I'm soured on the series going forward, and yet
That's actually See, this is one thing that I wonder about too, is how much of this is actually his real perspective, or if he's just kind of jumping on the bandwagon of not liking certain parts of the game based on the community reaction, right? Because it's a similar thing where, from what I've seen in the wider community, there is a significant portion of the audience. I don't know how much. I'm not going to put like a percentage or anything, but there's a significant portion of the audience that has a problem with the end game of Elden Ring. And the problems that they see are various and different, but there is a general acknowledgement that the ending content of Elden Ring has problems. And I think that is something where he said, this game kind of the end game of this game kind of puts you off to the series moving forward. I'd agree with that. Like, there are elements in the end game that even after all the patches, I would say make me not want to continue. And we'll see what he gets into in terms of the actual point by point of each of those things. But we'll see. We'll have to see how that goes. Agreed on exploration, though the DLC's exploration was disappointing. Yeah, the DLC's map should have been stuffed with way more things. It's very barren in several areas of it. Where you assume something would be, especially like on the southern sort of peninsula area, there is fuck all there. Like, there's not even items, right? It's like it's a couple of gravewort things that you could pick up, and then it's just like there's so little in the DLC comparative to other areas. Like, you take Limgrave, for example, it's stuffed with stuff, right? As soon as you get out of the gate, like, if you head just straight north from where you spawn into Limgrave, you will go through a boss, a site of grace with a vendor. There'll be a cave off to your left. There'll be a lake off to your right, which each house like enemies and a boss each. Then you get to a ruin with a map, right, that you can explore. And if you keep going north, you're going to find the pathway to just before Stormvale Castle, and then you keep going north, and you'll end up going to the next zone, right? Like if you just head in one sort of rough direction, you're going to find a ton of shit. In Shadow of the Erdtree, you're going to be running through a lot of enemies that just don't really have anything besides just weak dudes or a repeated enemy that won't drop you anything valuable. It's just a lot of nothingness. But we'll probably get to that in due time. Fighting your own biases can be very hard, but it's worth a try. I would agree. Yeah, fighting biases is quite hard for me, but I have reached a point where I'm not blinded by it. Yeah, and the main thing is just acknowledging that you have a bias, right? Because plenty of people don't go into a thing acknowledging their bias, right? They assume that everyone thinks like them, and that shows their bias, right? Where everybody hates X, Y, or Z because I hate X, Y, or Z, Now, there are things that are sort of mostly universally hated things. Like, I'm of the mind that, and I think most people would agree that, I think that insta-kill moves in combat games are generally frowned upon, right? Especially if they're extremely quick, and they're a surprise, right? Like, ambush insta-kills are a thing that many people do not like, right? That's something that I could say with relative confidence that most people would agree that insta-kill moves, especially in combat games, are very annoying and don't add to the experience, right? And I'm talking actual like insta kill moves, not moves that deal high damage and may kill you because you don't have enough health. I mean like actual insta kill moves, right? Like the Death Blight, like instantly killing you once it fills up. That's really annoying. Why do you have that? I strongly dislike the endgame of Elden Ring. I think the damage you take when committing to a whopping 60 vigor is too much. Yes. Are you fucking kidding me? Fuck you, FromSoft. Seriously, fuck you. Yeah. I'm assuming that quote's from me when Radon enchanted me with his simpiness, and then I just died. But anyway, back to this video. I keep ranting about other shit. I need to just watch the video and react to it.
The things the game does well were so good that they survived that descent. This one is going to be spicy. There are going to be spoilers. Don't watch until you've played the game yourself.
Why do all the cutscenes that he's referencing have like the Japanese text over them? Just I wonder why that is. Like, I mean, did he watch the trailer in Japanese? I don't know. I find it odd.
Is Elden Ring a masterpiece? Yeah, probably, but it's a shattered one.
So it's not one. Again, it's that vague shit going, it's a masterpiece, but I mean, if you have to put anything after that but, then it's not a masterpiece. Right? A masterpiece does not have problems. That's like generally the like I'm gonna Google it right now. Masterpiece definition. Okay. Masterpiece, a work of outstanding artistry, skill, or workmanship. All right, so is this a masterpiece by that definition? Right? Is that a masterpiece of, is this a masterpiece of quality and consistency? I'd say no. You know. Yeah, I'm gonna watch that clip until I memorize it. I'll have fun. There's a lot of fuck yous in that last Elden Ring DLC stream. Anyway, but yeah, let's get into him. I need to quit arguing semantics with him just because his semantics are different than mine. So we'll see how this goes.
Don't tell me you don't see it. Look up at the sky.
Are we?
Elden Ring is similar to another masterpiece, Outer Wilds, in a tragically specific way. You can only experience it properly one single time. Some of the best works of art are like that and leave you with a deep longing by the end. They're the kind of things you wish you could wipe your memory of so you can go back again blind. Dark Souls 1 is also like that for me. The other games in this series, surprisingly, not so much. But whereas Outer Wilds is elevated by a deeply profound realization of how this one-time experience quality links to its themes and truly your own unique life that you are living right now, Elden Ring can only be played once because the impressiveness of its content doesn't survive after first contact.
That's something that I would fundamentally disagree with, because a lot of the appeal of these games is the depth of the way the systems work in it, right? Now, granted, the first experience of these games is different from every subsequent experience because you've played through it once, right? So you know it's coming, you have a rough idea of where things are coming, and the more you replay it, you get over the shock factor, you get over the exploration factor, and you get involved into the mechanics and the lore of it all, right? Like, so the newness factor fades, but what holds you are the mechanics and the storytelling that takes place, right? It's a similar thing to what happens when you watch a movie, right? When you watch a great movie, you know, it's a great movie, right? No matter what genre it's in, right? But the first time through, you're tense because you don't know what's coming. The second time through, you can really appreciate everything that helps build up to the thing that you know is coming, right? And that's what good artistry does, is it takes you on a journey, and upon repeat experiences, you come to appreciate it more because of the effort taken to make that entire experience work and flow and have good setups to good payoffs and stuff like that. What I would call bad things that have a problem like what he's talking about are things that have a twist that ruin the entire premise of a story, right? Like a good example is the movie Signs, right? The M. Night Shyamalan, whatever that, however you say his name. right? The whole thing where, alien invasion movie, the aliens are slowly creeping in, trying to get at the family or whatever. Then you find out the aliens are weak to water, like it's like acid to them. That radically changes how you look at the movie, because the aliens are invading a planet that's 75% water, and they're running around on a planet where it rains literal death liquid on them. It's like and they run around without suits on. They're just fleshy meat bags that can be literally melted to pieces when it rains. It's like that radically changes how you view the entire film afterwards. That twist does not help the film, it hurts it. The aliens are retarded for coming to a planet with this much death on it. Right? It would be like if we went to a magma planet and we skipped around in our underwear, when it rains fire from the sky and there's magma pools everywhere. It's like, this might not be a planet we should go to without at least some protection, or go to at all. It's it's that kind of thing that ruins shit, like on repeat experiences. This is one reason why jump scares in movies age really poorly, because they're entirely built on the surprise. Especially if they're not actually something scary. Like I remember watching some Paranormal Activity movie a while ago, and the jump scare was a cat ran in front of the camera, and there's an audio stinger. It's like on repeat watches, that's not scary. It's not even surprising anymore because I know it's coming, right? But when you look at something like Alien, for example, upon rewatching Alien, that tension, that build up to the alien encounter with the face hugger, and then the chest burster, and then the alien actually picking the crew off, that tension is still there. You know what's happening, but you get to appreciate the buildup of it upon subsequent watches, right? And that's one reason why a lot of things lose value over time. Is it's also a thing too, where it's also one of the reasons why everyone goes to see those Avatar movies, right? And then people forget them within like a year, right? Like they each make like $2.5 billion, but then people forget about them. A large portion of the audience forget about them because they're just pretty colors with a very basic story and like really basic characters. They're not really that interesting beyond the technical level of it, and a lot of people forget about them. It's that kind of thing where there's so much going on. It's just there's a first experience and then repeated experiences. And I found that the most value can be gained by really focusing on what people get on repeated experiences. Initial shock value only goes so far. If people aren't going to stay and rewatch it, you've got something that's going to age extremely fast and become outdated extremely fast and lose its value over time. Yeah. All right. I need to catch up on chat. I keep ranting and then all this stuff. See, with how hard Joseph is going to crack down on the bosses, it probably wasn't a masterpiece. Well, we'll see. I would agree that the bosses are probably the biggest problem with Elden Ring, at least right now. That opinion might shift as I work on my video, but we'll see. Plus the replay value. You're telling me you don't want to go back and try some of the flashy, hard-hitting stuff this game spoon feeds you? That's dumb, LeMayo. You could kick the alien's ass in your own home by going in your fridge. Yeah, or just water gun. Just a water gun. Oh, hey, Brettflix. Haven't seen you in a while. Just popping into the stream, I found Anderson's video odd a lot of the time. His opening, which was mostly a joke, still came across as very bitter to me. Is he usually that bitter in his videos? It seems like I don't really know if it's bitterness, but it seems like he's sort of, from everything I've seen through various videos that I've seen of his and comments he's made, he seems like a very stubborn old man, even though he's not old, from my experience. Again, I've never interacted with him directly, so I can't say, but he sounds like a guy that doesn't really shift his opinions very often from what I've seen, and tends to go in with sort of a preconceived notion of what something is, and if it doesn't meet that expectation, he will judge it harshly and oftentimes unfairly. His coverage of Soma is a good example of that, which I might cover that video in the future because I think Soma's fucking amazing. But we'll see how that goes in the future. On the horror movie bit, it doesn't help that they telegraph the jump scares so hard and / startle you with obnoxiously loud booming effects. Yeah, audio stingers are annoying. They were just laughing away. Yeah. Sorry, I have to laugh. Yes, if it isn't DS2, expect bitterness. Just saw The Shining in a theater. I got to appreciate the gradual build of tension throughout the movie. Truly masterful. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of great movies that you can rewatch and appreciate the details that make things more that help the whole project flow more, right? I rewatched the Star Wars, the only Star Wars that matter, 1 through 6, and yeah, fight me, and I showed them to my wife because she had not seen them, and upon going back through Empire Strikes Back, I found I didn't really appreciate this the first couple times I watched it, but after thinking about it, it's like, The Empire Strikes Back has a lot that it goes through. It gives a lot of world building, characterization, and it keeps the plot moving while also delving into the characters and explaining things at a very quick pace. Like, you get a lot of information in Empire Strikes Back through just interactions, right? And it's very well paced to give you a lot of information very quickly where it's easy to understand, but it's also not overly complicated, right? Like, there's no info dump. It's just a bunch of really quick little points that help build up this larger world and narrative and characterization between the characters and how everything sort of flows in this universe at that particular time in the story. It's like, like good storytelling does that, where they give you a lot of information in the shortest amount of time that's understandable, and you can move past it quickly without having to really delve into it to fully get it, right? But it's smart, concise writing. The Lord of the Rings live action trilogy are also a good example of that, of giving you lots of information very quickly that gives you a lot of context and builds the world and immerses you all at once, right? It's basically it's efficient storytelling, right? It's efficient doing whatever you're doing in whatever medium you're doing it in, and it's something that I appreciate in a lot of movies and TV shows, when they can give you information, when they can tell you things very quickly with just a few couple actions, right? Everything's not literally, you are the bad man, and now I will defeat you because you hurt my family. It's not as blunt and cringe as that. There's subtlety to it, which again adds to replay value. The Thing from John Carpenter will never lose value to me to this day. Figuring out how people became things is fresh for me. Yeah, like that's another thing, is that, along with keeping things unexplained, is part of the charm too. Like, one of the biggest problems with the Alien series is that Ridley Scott went back with Prometheus and Alien Covenant and basically over-explained the alien, right? And he went back and over-explained everything in the most mundane, boring ways possible. And so the franchise fell off after that because, it's like you revealed things that A, we didn't need answers to, and B, you gave us the worst answers possible. It's like Solo, a Star Wars story, where we learned that Han Solo's last name, Solo, comes from some random Imperial officer giving him that name because he doesn't have a people, right? Like, why did we have to have, like, that's such a mundane way to get your last name. If he just had it, that would be better than this really crappy backstory for how you have it. Like, it's just a terrible, way to fill in a gap that doesn't need to be filled to begin with. Bought some of myself today, so going to enjoy it after watching Mahler cover it. It is a good game, but I would say, Andrew, to that, if you played The Dark Descent before it, you should know it is not like The Dark Descent in terms of how the scares work. I don't know how much spoiler territory you've gotten through Mahler's videos covering it, but I would say that going into it, you need to remember that this is not an Amnesia game. It's a very different game from Amnesia. So don't expect that kind of horror, so to speak. Because that's one thing that Joseph Anderson went into kind of expecting, and that's part of the reason why his coverage of it was kind of uniquely bad. So J.A. is a mid-wit normie trying to satisfy a normie audience, basically? Potentially. I think his tastes are genuine. I just think that he's kind of stubborn in admitting when he gets something wrong or when his opinion changes. Like, I feel like he's got a shifting standard, not so much that he's a normie, right? Like, I think he has opinions, and when challenged, he doesn't really want to defend them, but he also doesn't want to back down from what I've seen. Like I don't think that I don't really think he's a normie as much as he just doesn't want to retract his opinions, but he also doesn't want to change them either. So I'm not sure. But Amnesia as well got the full expectation on things, and I know that Joseph doesn't think horror games exist. Yeah. If you don't get scared in a horror game, it's not a horror game. That's Joseph Anderson, circa 2015 or something. It's like, holy shit, dude. Anyway, let's get back to this video.
So I repeat, again, very soon into this video, because it's so important, don't watch this before playing the game yourself. And also, play Outer Wilds. You owe it to yourself. I'm not saying you can't replay Elden Ring and have fun. I've done 3 playthroughs and had varying amounts of enjoyment, but as you can see from the list on the screen, the time played is very different after the first one.
And that is one thing that I will give to him as well, that he is correct on. The first run of playthrough, the first run of Elden Ring is probably going to take you the longest time because there's so much to explore, right? But upon a second playthrough, like once you know where everything is, your playtime for that run's gonna is gonna be much smaller because you'll learn, as you play the game that there's really no point to go to this ruin for this talisman because my build won't use this shit and I won't get that many souls or runes out of it anyway, so I'll just ignore it. And that happens for a lot of stuff in this game where you just kind of ignore certain things because the rune counts are very low relative to where they are, or they just have gear you don't need. So a lot of people will just ignore it on subsequent playthroughs, and they'll hone their build, and just get the things that they need for their build, which I think is kind of common. But in terms of the drop off from what you do your first playthrough to what you do your next playthrough in Elden Ring, I think that drop off is significantly larger than every game previously. Now, it's partially because there's a fuck ton of optional shit in Elden Ring compared to all the other games, but it's still sort of a noticeable difference when your repeat playthroughs are grab the stuff for your build, go to the main bosses, end the game, right? And this is the problem when you make a game that's buffered so much by optional shit, is that it brings the game down a peg when you do it that way. I was watching an old EFAP and seeing you super chat. I got excited. Yeah. I watched EFAP. I watched EFAP for a while, and then I got busy with my own shit and didn't keep up with it, but I've been getting back into it. I thought about restarting it, but that's like 300 episodes worth minimum of like 4 to 12-hour streams, and it's like, Jesus Christ, man, I don't know if I have that much time. I got a life to live. I need to be better with my choices of time. But anyway.
Part of this is because, of course, I now know where to go and the like, but it goes further than that into I now know which areas are a waste of time, either for the build I'm playing or just outright the area is boring and not worth the visit. Your first time through, you won't feel that as much. The novelty of each location is pristine, and even if you happen to encounter a few of the lackluster locations back to back, there are enough attractive places with cool things in them that it's unlikely you'll get worn down to the point of having a bad enough time to not want to continue exploring. My expectations for this game, right up until the moment I ran it for the first time, were that it would have a hub world about the scale of a modernized version of Hyrule Field from Ocarina of Time. The map you see on the screen...
Why does he keep referencing like that last little clip of this thing right here?
About the scale of a modernized version of Hyrule Field from Ocarina of Time. The map you see on...
Yeah, like he references Ocarina of Time and shows footage of a modded Skyrim. Like, why? Like, why couldn't you just put footage of Ocarina of Time in, right? I mean, it doesn't even have to be your footage. It could just be generic gameplay footage of that game. Like, why do you pick like, he references something and puts a random clip in the background and it does not mesh at all. And I don't understand why I don't understand how he edits things or how his people edit things if he works with a team. I don't know how much he does of this on his own. But, like, I don't get why he edits some things. And yes, that is not Ocarina of Time. It's like, why'd you do that? Just from like a production standpoint, just I wonder how you do things and why you do things the way you do.
on the screen right now of just Upper Limgrave was what I expected in size, with several connecting zones and huge traditional Dark Souls style levels in orbit around them. So like an open world Firelink Shrine zone with lots of routes and links back that uncover more areas and options as you progress and come back. I would still like to play a game like that because Elden Ring isn't it. Upper Limgrave on the screen right now is about 1/15 of the total play area, not including the dungeons. This is very much a traditional style open world in terms of size and how much it stretches over an area horizontally. Not all of it is as dense with stuff to find and delve into, but if we're talking about explorable territory, this is a small fraction of the game. Elden Ring is huge, and that's one of the most impressive things about it, enough to even impress Shania Twain, largely because it maintains a high level of beauty and freshness throughout it all, assuming you're not sick of the usual Dark Souls fare, that is, because while this may be a more glorious medieval fairy tale fantasy style than usual for From, it has a lot of the same trimmings that we've seen in the past games. I personally didn't mind. That's
I mean, that's probably the biggest praise I would give to the game is just in terms of like bang for your buck, in terms of content. Elden Ring is pretty great, right? Like if you pay, I forget how much it would be if you get like the super edition of Elden Ring that includes the DLC. But I mean, even if you pay like even if you pay like $100 for like a super duper version of the game that includes the DLC, you're still getting a lot of content to go through, like in the game, just from a content to dollar perspective, right? And that's one thing that I will give Elden Ring is that it definitely does deliver on content. Like it gives you shit to do all the time, right? And even on repeat playthroughs, it gives you shit to do on, in terms of progression sake and all this other stuff. So that is definitely a massive boon to the game, is that the map is huge and there's so much to do and so much to collect, right? I threw my snacks everywhere. Damn. But yeah, it's just that's probably one of the biggest pros of Elden Ring is that there's so much in the game.
It's not to say it isn't special among current open world titles. There is a great placement of verticality as a boundary to pen areas into contained exploration zones, but also as a way to beckon you to explore. It's possible that something like Horizon Zero Dawn or Assassin's Creed Valhalla may do this better. I still haven't played them, but for me, this is the best construction of an open world I've seen, whereas Witcher 3 still takes it for immersion. Things look good at a distance. Things also look good up close. If you see something interesting, then with very few exceptions, I'm actually struggling to think of them right now, you are able to get there. Even an elevated plateau that you see early on and might give up on reaching because the method of getting there is near the end game. Points of interest will dominate the horizon. An academy like a man-made mountain will define the skyline of a zone, and when you pass it, there will be something new that calls to you. You'll climb higher and see something else right away. In the way that Dark Souls kept surprising you by how far down you can go, Elden Ring shocks you by how high you'll keep going. Those points of interest aren't just beautiful and stunning in scale, their size is also functional in obscuring the next areas from you. Although you can
And this is one thing too. A lot of the stuff he's saying about this level design, I'm fully agreeing with. Right, like Elden Ring does really well in regards to giving you lots of stuff to look at, and then once you get through looking at them, you begin exploring them, and upon completing exploring them, you have a whole new area to explore, and that loop kind of repeats over and over and over in this game with a lot of different stuff, which again I think is a really good thing.
see hints of what's to come if you're persistent in exploring the edges of zones. For 4 nights in a row while playing this game, I ended my sessions with the thought, I'm about halfway done, I think, and I still wasn't on any of those nights. I thought this area up the Grand Lift of Dectus was the final zone after the trio that you can explore at the start, Limgrave, Liurnia, and Caelid. And depending on the order you do things in, by the time you beat the boss at the capital in the Altus Zone, you might still not be halfway done with what Elden Ring has to offer. The map plays a crucial...
Now that I would disagree with a little bit, because the halfway point of Elden Ring is sort of nebulous because a lot of people define it differently, right? Like I define halfway points in games based on objectives, right? And I think you have to qualify that when you say things like that, right? Like, for example, the Ornstein and Smo fight in Dark Souls 1 is kind of regarded as the midpoint of the game, because it's sort of like it's roughly the halfway point in terms of content that you've gone through, right? So you go through the Asylum, Undead Burg, Undead Parish, the Depths, Blighttown, and Sen's Fortress to get there, right? That's Sen's Fortress and then Anor Londo by extension, right? So that's 7 areas in Dark Souls that you've gone through by the time you get to Ornstein and Smo, right? And they basically cap off Anor Londo, right? After that, you go through probably the Valley of the Drakes. That's probably the most optional area. But like Valley of Drakes, New Londo Ruins, Darkroot Garden, Darkroot Basin. The names are killing me right now. The Demon Ruins, Lost Izalith, the Duke's Archives, and I think I got all of them. No, the Catacombs, and Tomb of the Giants. Yeah, so that's 9 areas after you've completed the first sort of 7, and at that point you return to Firelink Shrine and you go to the final area to beat the game, right? So Ornstein and Smo is sort of the kind of the end or the beginning of the halfway point, roughly, right? With Elden Ring, on the other hand, it's measured very differently, right? Because in terms of what you need to do in order to kind of reach the halfway point from like an objective sort of level, or sort of by extension, right? So actually, let me go back and explain the Dark Souls thing. So there's a bunch of different areas in Dark Souls, and roughly around the halfway point of progression, you've gotten to Ornstein and Smo, right? Roughly halfway, give or take an area or two, right? And then if you look at it from sort of an objective lens, and I don't mean like objective as in like this is factual. I mean like this is your objective to do, right? Your first objective is escape the Asylum, right? Your second objective is to ring the 2 bells of awakening, right? Your next objective is to seek out Sen's Fortress and go to Anor Londo, right? Then after that, you place the Lord Vessel on the thingy. Then you go to the 4 corners, grab all the Lord Souls, and your last goal is to defeat Gwyn and pick your ending, right? So there's roughly 6 objectives, right? First one's escape the Asylum. Second one is ring the bells, and third one is basically get to Anor Londo, right? So again, Ornstein and Smo cap off that area, roughly the halfway point from like an objective to objective sort of thing. When you look at Elden Ring by sort of similar metrics in terms of like areas, it's a lot harder to define, because Elden Ring, if you want to break it down, has sort of a layer approach to each area, right? So you'll have the zone, Limgrave, for example. You have the main area, Stormvale Castle, and then you'll have the main boss, Godfrey, right? And that kind of persists throughout each zone. Like in Caelid, you have Caelid, then you have Redmane Castle, then you have Radahn. Liurnia, you have Liurnia, then you have Raya Lucaria Academy, then you have Renala, right? And that persists throughout the entire game, right? In terms of things that you actually need to do to progress, you need to kill 2 demigods, right? And that could be any 2 of them, and then the pathway opens up to get into. Well, this is there are ways around this, but the traditional objective way, the way most people will do it, is you'll kill 2 demigods, then you'll get into Lanedale, then you'll kill Morgoth, then you'll progress, right? So in terms of area by area, what you need to do in order to progress, right, and what you would assume is the natural sort of play order of progression, is you'd probably start in Limgrave, right? Probably gonna find your way up to Stormvale Castle, and then you're gonna fight Godric, right? So you went to an area, you found the castle, you went to the area, then you killed the main boss. Okay, let's just assume that those two are objectives, right? You have those two objectives, right, for each area. Then you go to, let's say, Liurnia next, and then you kill Renala. All right, now you've reached 4 objectives completed. 2 areas down, 2 main bosses down. But because you don't have the key for the lift, maybe you go back to Caelid to get the key, and then you try to fight Radon, right? You have to trigger him using specific things, but you go through that area, right? Maybe okay, so you go through the area to get the key, but you don't kill Radon, right? So that now you're up to 5 objectives. You go up the lift, right? And then you go through Altus Plateau. By this point, you'll have access to Lanedale. So you'll go to Lanedale, then you'll kill Morgott, and then you'll have to burn the tree somehow, right? So you follow the pathway through the, I forget what the area is called. Is it Forbidden Woods or whatever? It's the snowy area that connects Lanedale to Mountaintops of the Giants. It's that little tiny area. But like you have that, you go through there, then you go through Mountaintops of the Giants. You fight the giant, the fire giant. Then you burn the tree. Then you wake up in Farum Azula, fight your way through there to get the, Destined Death thingy. And then you go to the capital after it's been burnt, and you've basically just do a boss run, and then you beat the game, right? So in terms of objectives in this game, it's a lot harder to pin down exactly which thing you're going to do, because before you can get access to Lanedale, you have 4 lords you can access, or 4 demigods that you can access. Technically more, depending on how you want to get around certain things. But it's one of those things where you have 4 options that are available and sort of level appropriate by that point, like by the time you get to Lanedale. But after you get to Lanedale, you have 2 major areas to go through, and then a boss gauntlet, and then you're done with the game, right? So there's a significant drop off in content from Morgott to the end of the game, right? And so the end point, the halfway point of Elden Ring can't be Morgott, right? Because there's just not enough after him, like compared to what comes before him, right? And so defining where the middle point of Elden Ring is gets very confusing, and that's part of the reason why balancing in this game is kind of all over the place, because it's very hard to account for what level a player will be at a particular point in a particular area, because there's so much that they can do in between getting to an area versus getting to the main boss of that area, right? Like you can go from spawning into Limgrave to Margit to Godric and only gain like maybe 20 levels, if you take like sort of traditional pathways, right? But if you go through the entirety of Limgrave and try to do everything that you can find before Godric, you're going to have at least another like 20 to 30 levels on top of your 20 to 30 levels that you probably picked up going through Stormvale Castle, right? And that leveling thing is is very hard to balance and account for, and because if you can't account for that, then they have to change the way the leveling system works, or the way they scale damage, and that gets into a whole different realm of how do you balance things across games that have very hard things to predict, and that gets complicated, but just it's very hard to define sort of where certain points of progression are in Elden Ring because it's so open world and vast, but the objectives are relatively simple in terms of getting from A to B. And that's part of the reason why it's hard to pick certain points in Elden Ring for like, okay, here's the halfway point. All right. It's like, it's very hard to find where the halfway point is in Elden Ring because there's just so much, right? Like, is the halfway point getting up the first lift? Is that the halfway point? Because if you break it down by area, you have access to Limgrave, Liurnia, and Caelid to begin with. And then after the lift, you have Altus Plateau, Mount Gelmir, Mountaintops of the Giants. I always forget that area because there's hardly anything there. Then you have Farum Azula, and then you're basically done with the game, right? Not including DLC or the underground areas, right? So the lift might be the halfway point. Alto's Plateau in general might be the halfway point, but because of the way progression works in this game, it's very hard to predict exactly where that is. And I think that's part of the problem with why the end game is the way it is, because the devs aren't sure exactly how to balance the enemies in the end, like per level, like in terms of like what they think players will be able to deal with. So they either have to undercrank or overcrank the enemies to make them way harder or way easier, or they try to find some vague thing in the middle where they think a player might be this level with this amount of skill to deal with this amount of like difficulty, right? And I think that might be part of the problem. I'm going to stop this rant in a minute, but I know I've been going for like 5 minutes on this. But I think part of the reason why the end game of Elden Ring is so problematic is that they haven't had a proper way to balance it given all the options available to players up until the end game. And I think that has also affected the DLC because they have to one-up the difficulty of the end game of Elden Ring while at the same time trying to account for what players can do. And players could already do some crazy shit in base Elden Ring. So to up the ante, they said, we need to make things even crazier, but we also need to give players even more crazier things to use to outdo the base game. And it's like, you keep kind of trying to out crazy both the player and the bosses, and you eventually get to a point where it just becomes a clusterfuck. And that's kind of what sort of the end game of the DLC becomes at a point, where there's just so much shit going on that it becomes just kind of a mess, and the flow of combat takes a drastic turn for the worst. Oh God, it's Joseph Henderson. I'll be frank, I think his videos are abysmal, and his Shadow of the Earth review is possibly the worst one I've ever seen about the DLC. I might look into it. I don't know. If I'm going to review this, I feel like it would be fair to review that video at some point, but I don't know. That might be the last Joseph Henderson thing I've reviewed for a while. But anyway, let's get back to this video. I ranted for like 10 minutes. It was that bad? Well, this is the thing is like, without spoilers, I assume that it's bad because I imagine he would praise things in the DLC that most people would find annoying for it to be that way, because I've seen a lot of people have positive reviews of the DLC, but I've also seen a fair amount of negative ones. And I don't know if it's just because I'm in the group that would detract from the DLC because of a lot of the problems that you can find in it, or if it's just sort of a general consensus that the DLC has some problems, but overall it's still fun, kind of a thing. Like I wonder, like discussion on Elden Ring is very split. Like there's a lot of people that like it, a lot of people that don't, a lot of people that like what they're doing, a lot of people that don't like what they're doing, and it just gets confused. The larger the player base gets, the more these two groups are going to have to figure out how to deal with each other. Also, yeah, that is most certainly an issue. They went so hard on trying to outdo themselves that most cooperators are using shields for Radon. Yeah. Well, this is one thing too, is I think that if a boss, like here's one way that I could view it, right, is take well, yeah, like what you're saying, Sheep, I've never seen so many people be roped into a specific build type because of a boss being that capable of one comboing you. Yeah, well, this is one thing that I would draw a comparison to, and you'll understand why in a second. Compare the second DLC, or compare the DLC Radon fight to the Moonlight Butterfly fight from Dark Souls 1. And bear with me, this will sound weird in the beginning. But the way your build works kind of defines how combat in the fight with the Moonlight Butterfly works, right? Because if you're a tank build, or like a parry build, or like a bleed build, you're not going to be able to hit the butterfly unless it lands, right? So you kind of have a green light, red light situation where you can't attack it, unless you're going to throw shit at it, or unless you got a bow, right? But caster builds, right, like miracle users with lightning, or sorcerers, or pyromancers, they're going to have shit to throw at the boss. So your build drastically impacts the way that fight works. But given that, it's not limited to one specific build just completely owns the boss, right? Like it's kind of a half and half situation where melee builds have a hard time, but range builds have a significant advantage. The Radon fight takes things to an extreme where if you're not good, where if you dodging with all the builds that don't use shields primarily makes the fights drastically harder. But if you have a shield and know the couple of attacks to dodge, namely the grabs, and if you just work conservatively with your stamina, you will have a hard time dying to Radon unless you just make a really bad decision at a really bad time, right? Like the pokey build thing, like one of the simplest builds, like to have, makes Radon a bitch. And that's part of the problem is they spend all this time making this crazy boss, and I can just poke him to death from behind the shield, right? Like that kind of that kind of build, just making arguably one of the hardest bosses in the game, just an absolute bitch of a boss, really impacts the entire difficulty of the fight, right? Now, granted, you don't have to fight him like that. You're not forced into that. But the fact that there is one build that can just radically destroy this boss with very little effort, mind you, like just have a shield that blocks decently and a weapon that thrusts, and just don't make stupid mistakes in the fight. Like don't heal mid attack and stuff like that. Like don't do things like that. As long as you're careful and have the right build, Radon's not that hard in the DLC. It's just a matter of knowing like when you actually do need to dodge. And this is kind of the comparison to Melania, right? Melania is difficult because that build does not work well against her. Not to say you can't beat her like that, but Melania's self-healing discourages you from blocking because she'll just get health back. So you may as well dodge. And that's the thing that makes her fight cumbersome, but also makes the builds less worthwhile with a shield. So they've kind of taken a problem and then reversed it, where they made a boss that overcompensates massively throughout all the various moves Radon has in the DLC, but then he becomes a basic bitch once you just poke him from behind a shield. Whereas the previous hardest boss of the game, Melania, had the exact opposite effect, where blocking was discouraged because she gets health back anyway. So it kind of defeats the purpose of blocking. If you can try to dodge it, you're better off to dodge it than to block it. Most of the time, unless you're doing some crazy like stun build with a shield, right? But the problem sort of still stands. It's like they took sort of two different things from the Melania and Radon fights that both have similar problems from a build to build perspective in terms of how the different builds deal with the enemy. And that becomes an issue. I need to catch up on chat. I've been ranting forever. All right. Speaking of Elden Ring's endgame balance, it's a fundamental issue with just copy pasting Souls mechanics and putting it in an open world. These games' leveling system just doesn't work well here. I think it could work well, but they'd have to do some serious thought into balancing. But the open world aspect definitely does fuck with the balancing of leveling up. I don't want to shit too hard on JA, but ever since he streamed Silent Hill 2 and his conclusion was the town makes him stupid, I can't take him seriously. What kind of take is that? The town makes him stupid? I mean, I can get like a joke coming out of that, but holy shit. Health is still based around a single stat, which means the devs can't know how much players will spend on vitality, especially when this game promotes build freedom, or pretends to anyway. Yeah, well, this is one thing that all the games that they've made have suffered from, is kind of like, where do you hold, like, what's the appropriate amount of health to have at a given point, And that's something that they've always had issues with, because there are plenty of moments throughout the Dark Souls games, and Bloodborne and Demon Souls, where are you supposed to have X amount of health? Are you supposed to have 500 health here, 800 health, 1,000, 1,200, 1,500? How much are you actually supposed to have by this point in the game? And there's, that's one thing where I think, from my limited experience with Sekiro, I think Sekiro does a decent job of kind of figuring a way around the sort of basic leveling up system based on what I've seen from playing Sekiro for a couple hours. The way it's not the straightforward Souls leveling system. Like you get sort of like decent upgrades that are sort of big chunk upgrades as opposed to little bitty stat increases here and there. So I'd have to delve into Sekiro more, but I think it is a thing where, as it stands now with the Elden Ring leveling up system and how they account for that, it's definitely fucked, and they need to rethink what they're doing, because this is going to be a problem moving forward if they continue to make super open world things like this. All right. You know what? That actually does make sense, and I pray they never nerf the shield poke strategy. Well, that's the thing. If they do nerf it, I feel like the community would be very mad about that, because As far as I know, the only way they could nerf that is to increase the block damage that Radon does in terms, like, while you're guarding, or they'd have to severely nerf the talismans that aid in shield blocking, right? So I think either way they lose, right? Either way, it's a bad decision. So I don't know if they'll nerf. They probably won't nerf it, because I just think that if they did nerf it, it would lead to so many problems with other builds, or it would lead to so many problems with that build in general that, you know, you may as well just not use a shield in the game, which would discourage people from using a shield in the DLC or in total, right? Like, if they make some arbitrary rule in the DLC that enemies deal more block damage, then you're just killing a build that players spent probably dozens of hours honing in the base game. You know, I don't think there's a way for them to nerf it and come out on top, you know, where they made an actual good decision. I think every option, at least every option I can think of, would be bad. But that might just be it. Maybe that's just how it is. We just poke Radon to death and that's it. Maybe that's how it's going to be. The godlike being with unfathomable powers when I hold a big slab of metal and poke him with a stick. Yes, that is how it be. May the unbeatable God Lord, and when pre-nerf I spam simple thorns at him. Yeah. Also, doubling back on what Jan said about Vitality hosts when I co-op with them and they have a whopping 900 HP against Radigan. Yeah, well, I mean, again, it's just cranking numbers is not the way to go for balancing sake, right? Like you have to take everything into account. You know, that's one reason why I don't like the co-op in these games very much, is because oftentimes all they do to deal with the boss is just crank their defenses, right? You know, or just crank their health up. You know, it doesn't really make the encounter more engaging. You know, it just takes longer to do shit. With 900 HP, every enemy in the game can fart in your direction and you'll die. Yeah, in the end game, I'm pretty sure that most bosses have several hits that do over that. I definitely know that all the big moves do way more than that. Probably like at least like 1,200 to 1,500, not including DLC. I mean, I remember you saw it, Sheep, on that one stream where we were fighting the dragon in the DLC, like the big one. I forget his name because that's how forgettable he is. Where he did 2,000 damage to me in a single hit with upgrades to my defenses. Like, that's absurd, right? And I've made this point before where it's like, you know, if they keep pushing the difficulty in this direction and the balancing in this direction, we're eventually just going to get to a point where you may as well drop health as a total thing and just have lives, right? Like old school arcade games like Pac-Man and Galaga and shit, where you just have lives. If you get hit, that's one life away, and you have 3, 4, 5 lives. After they're gone, you're toast. Deal with it. You know, maybe you have flasks that restore lives, but I feel like they're pushing that line, you know, where we're going to get to a point where just the enemies deal so much fucking damage that there's really no point, you know, to having health. It's just lives, you know. Yeah, just upping boss HP discourages summoning and makes the bosses absurdly hard for no reason for having the audacity to have friends. Yeah. Anyway, back to this video. How long was I talking for? Like 20 minutes? Ooh, I gotta stay hydrated with all this talking I'm doing. And we're like 7 minutes in. This video might take way longer than I thought. LeMayo, yeah, and I told you about Bale one-shotting my 60 vigor character when I had 10 heals and he was low HP. Yeah. Again, one-shots, particularly in these types of games, are not good. I'm just going to say it very bluntly. They are not good. They don't add to the experience, especially if they deal absurd amounts of damage, even through like blocking or like resistance talismans. It's just like you're getting into the insane levels of difficulty that make me not want to play anymore. And this is one thing I've said, right, is if Dark Souls, like if Elden Ring was on the level of Dark Souls 3 difficulty, right, but just had more content to it, I don't think that would necessarily be a bad thing. Like, you don't have to one-up the difficulty in every single game, right? I think the cosmetic value and the mechanical value outweighs the difficulty angle, right? Like, imagine if we had Dark Souls 3 level difficulty in Elden Ring, right? But everything was scaled moderately appropriately, and instead of repeated assets, they just made unique enemies that fight differently instead of just regular enemies that show up over and over, right? I think that would be a fun game. You know, you're not pushing any boundaries, but you're also like doing something that people clearly enjoyed, right? From Dark Souls 3. You know, like doing the same thing again, but more of it isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Just like experimentation isn't inherently a good thing. You know, it's all about how does it work in the overall product, you know? The only thing I remember about Bale, the dragon whose name you couldn't remember, is that he's all wounded and missing body parts, yet moves extremely fast, sliding around faster than most enemies. Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, just absurd. I mean, of all the bosses in the game, I actually probably would put Bale low on the list of ones that I liked. Like, I really didn't like the Bale fight, like, over time. Like, even some of the fights that have more, like, bullshit measurements, it's like they've got bullshit to them, but they're not as extreme as Bale is. You know, like, Bale just has so much shit that just delays the fight, right? By him flying in the air. You know, Bale is the ultimate spectacle, but lack of mechanics boss, you know? And it's one of those things that I think does impact the fight when it looks pretty, but mechanically you basically just have to sit back while he does his special animation move. But anyway, we could talk about that later. I want to make some progress in this video. I don't want to Bloodborne this for like 3 months. You know.
Role in misleading you here and was clearly set up to do just that. Whereas Breath of the Wild wants to immediately dazzle you with its size, Elden Ring.
What the fuck? Why does he keep saying these references to something and then showing Skyrim clips? Is he memeing? Like, is this an in joke with him? I don't get it. It hurts, Joseph. It hurts. I don't get it. That isn't Zelda. Yeah. Please don't make it last 3 months. Once was enough. Oh man, we'll see what happens. I mean, thankfully this video is not that long, so yeah.
Holds it back. Shower versus grower. A large central part of the map is taken up by ocean that doesn't fill in until you get to one of the final areas, making it easy to be deluded into thinking this is an awkwardly shaped landmass and that you've seen most of what's in the game very early on. Then, surprise, there's all this extra territory waiting for you. A tremendous amount of content isn't always a good thing. In many ways, it isn't a positive here either, but we'll get to that in a moment. I want to continue singing its praises because this is by far the best part of the game. Exploring the open world in terms of traversal can definitely get dull, but the thrill of discovery and uncovering new things was a near bottomless bag of thrills, like a Christmas morning or a birthday party that keeps continuing from one room to another, each with a new round of presents when you were only expecting one. The best two parts about it for me were the surprises and how it feels like it belongs in this series. Elden Ring is the kind of game where you can enter a cave or a building and not know what you're going to get. It could be a short 10 to 15 minute affair with a few hallways and battle rooms and a quick boss. Or you could hit an illusory wall and reveal an entire multi-hour length zone that becomes a sprawling traditional Souls type dungeon with secrets and routes and checkpoints and bosses. Or it could be an elevator you ride down, start to wonder what's taking so long, and step out to a whole new world that has a second fucking map screen that you toggle between because one open world wasn't enough, apparently. It needed a second one. Elden Ring isn't Dark Souls 4. It's Dark Souls 4, 5, and 6 all at once. At least it is in terms of the scope of the world. Continuing that thread, it also feels like a Souls world you've been let loose in.
This is hurting. He's talked about the map, yet not made clear if it's good or bad. I mean, he said a lot of things that are positives, but then he's kind of like cautioned that positives by saying, not, extra stuff isn't always good, but I think this is a thing that most people would agree upon, is that the amount of content coming from exploration in Elden Ring is a good thing. Like, there is a lot of good stuff in Elden Ring, because of the exploration factor.
Mostly, or it does when you're playing it, but that feeling may diminish a bit when you go back to the previous games. After finishing Elden Ring, I played Dark Souls 1 and 3 all the way through again. I also played a few hours of Dark Souls 2, Sekiro, Bloodborne, and Demon Souls. I needed some footage for this video anyway, so I got to relive a bit of them. Whenever I've played these games, I've always imagined what was out of bounds, not in actuality with what the developer included that you could no-clip to, but in terms of fantasizing about what the rest of this unusual, grim world would be like if I could just wander it in any direction forever. The constrained open worlds of these games give you the impression that you're cutting through only a thin, dense slice of them on your adventure. Demon Souls is more the odd one out and feels like scattered pockets of a world you are dumped into that could have a more plain open world connecting them if you were free. When I first played Elden Ring, because of how brilliantly the dungeon areas were integrated into the open areas, it felt like an uncompromising realization of that feeling. I could vividly imagine starting off in something like Stormvale Castle or the capital, and then fighting my way out to freedom and marveling at the unfolding world before me, as if I could do that for Undeadburg as well as whatever is around it if the game was prepared for me to do so. To repeat, that's how it was when I was playing Elden Ring. Then I went back to Dark Souls 1 and could see that it wasn't as uncompromising as I thought. There are some areas that still maintain that quality, but traveling through Undeadburg to Darkroot Garden and Blighttown again made me understand that Elden Ring is closer to the standard open world formula than the fantasy I have about breaking through a wall in Dark Souls. Dark Souls 3 was also interesting in how it feels like a bunch of levels on platforms, arranged like a series of awkwardly stacked plates on a tray, rather than a tangle of routes you're cutting through in an otherwise full world. I want to stress, though, that I don't hold this against Elden Ring as a flaw, since the illusion they created worked my first time through, and that's something I'm going to have to say a few more times in this video. The first run of this game is very different than any subsequent ones.
I mean, again, this is the thing. First time going through these games is going to be different from subsequent playthroughs, but I think I understand where he's coming from with this, where there's a lot of stuff in Elden Ring to explore that kind of gives you an explorative charm to the game that is diminished the more you play the game. And I will agree with that point. I know he didn't explicitly state that, but I think that's what he's kind of getting at, is that the overworld, or that the entire world design encourages exploration, but upon exploring everything, you realize certain areas just aren't good for you based on your build and based on if you actually want like certain supplies or weapons or talismans and such. The illusion they created is wild. Yeah. Well, that whole illusion thing, I mean, I would say that Dark Souls 1 gave you the illusion of going through like cities while you were really locked to just sort of certain pathways through them, right? But it felt like a world because of the interconnectivity, right? Of being able to be like on top of the bridge, but be on top of the bridge after the Taurus demon, but then there's a ladder that leads you down, which takes you, down to the lower Undeadburg. But you can take a stairway up from that area and loop back around to the bonfire before the Taurus demon, right? All that interconnectivity makes it feel like a real place. But at the same time, upon replaying it, you kind of lose that factor of it feels like a real place, and instead it's like, okay, it becomes more video gamey the more you play it, right? Where it's like, this isn't an interconnected world, it's a checkpoint. There's a shortcut. There's da-da-da-da-da, like it diminishes over time. And I think Elden Ring's diminishing return on an exploration dramatically decreases as you go, like I said earlier. And that's, I think, what he's kind of getting at is, the first playthrough of this game, you will do a lot less in your second playthrough of Elden Ring than you will your first one. Comparative, like the content, right? Like if you played Dark Souls 3, for example, your first time through, right? Upon replaying the game, you're going to go through most of that content again, right? Just because most of it is mandatory to complete the game, like to beat the game. Not completely do everything, but to beat the game, right? In Elden Ring, you can ignore a good 90% of the content and beat the game. And that's the kind of drop off we're talking here, which is, which can be seen as problematic for repeat playthroughs, but I'm kind of in the middle on this, where the drop off isn't good, but the amount of content that you need to augment your build is put around the world so that while exploring, you can find stuff you need. And they all do serve a purpose, right? All these different areas do serve a purpose. Like they give you like a particular summon that you can use, or they give you a particular item that you can use in your build, or they give you a particular upgrade material, right? Like one of the bell bearings that lets you unlock shit to buy or whatever, right? They all have a purpose. They're not just vapid nothingness, right? But given that, they also don't give you a whole lot of rewards, period, given the level you're in, right? There comes a point where you're just not going to get a whole lot out of going through a dungeon, if you're playing a particular build. Like if you go through every dungeon in Limgrave, you're probably not going to use the stuff from like 5 of them, right? Like, or not 5 of them, but like you're probably not going to use, but maybe like 20-25% of the stuff you pick up in the dungeons, because a lot of them are for builds that you aren't using currently, right? And that impacts repeat playthroughs when you don't want to get shit for a particular build. Like if you ignore sorcery, you're basically going to not do a bunch of sorcery shit, right? So you're going to skip over a lot of things. Same thing with incantations or arcane stuff or, tank build stuff. All these different things that impact the way your build functions and the efficiency of it. A lot of that drops off in repeat playthroughs unless you're just going around to just do shit to go around, right? The other games didn't have that significant drop off, which I think makes the game feel worse on a second playthrough when it's not technically worse, but that drop off is still a problem from a playthrough perspective, where your first time through, you're exploring this massive world. It's amazing. There's so much stuff you get into. There's so many items to loot. Your second playthrough is, okay, I'm playing as this build. I know where everything is. Let's go over this and skip over 90% of the game, right? Like you're skipping over large chunks of the game just to get your build going, right? Whereas the first time is exploring, there's more to explore. And so the feeling feels different, even though mechanically you can still go through these areas and still gain benefits. And I think that's kind of the hard thing to discuss about replaying the game, is that there's so many things you can get throughout the game that impact the way you play it. But your first playthrough, that exploration factor is immense because of how much you can explore. But then it comes down to just the mechanical need of, I need this talisman for this build at this point, and I'm in this area. Let's go. It's not as zoned in. If I guess the way I would put it is, your repeated playthroughs are going to feel much more linear because you've found out where all the gear you want is, or where a large portion of it is, or where large amounts of useful things are, right? And that's one thing that I've found upon replaying the game several times over, is that if I play a knowledgeable run of Elden Ring, the first thing I do every single time is get out into Limgrave, and I immediately start running everywhere to grab all the seeds and all of the tears, right? Because those things will help my healing, and they will help me do everything else for every other build, right? And that can become kind of boring on repeat playthroughs, right? Now, you don't have to do it, but it is a thing where people will be sort of funneled into their own personal habits of playing the game their own particular way in the beginning, where you basically set yourself up to play the game and then you play the game. You know what I mean? Where you are running around collecting shit without actually engaging in like the fights as much as just picking up items that you need for extra healing or what have you, and that kind of impacts the way repeat playthroughs work, right? Like once you know where all the tiers and I just forgot the name of them. The seeds. Yeah, like when you know where all those are, you're going to immediately jump to go get those things, because those things help you throughout the entire rest of the game. And the sooner you stack up on those, the better. Which usually means you have sort of your playthrough broken up into the initial little bit being prep time, and then you actually start playing the game later, right, on repeat playthroughs. Because who doesn't want to start with 4 extra flasks than the base, like 4 you get? Like, who doesn't want to start with extra stuff, Now, plenty of people play without that, and they just naturally progress through the area, slowly getting the healing items and whatever else they want to get. But that option, kind of the open worldness mixed with the specific way that you upgrade your materials, makes players funnel into very particular lanes in terms of how they sort of set up their character before they actually start progressing, right? Because if all it requires to upgrade your healing is run to a place and pick up an item, and the world's this open world to begin with, you've got a lot of things to acquire before you even like start actually playing the game, which can make the opening bit of playing the game a little bit more boring than it probably is normally, because you have that knowledge, right? It's a thing that kind of adversely affects restarting a campaign, unless you just want to go in without the extra bonuses of the healing items or the talismans or whatever you happen to go farming for and pick up. Right. It's just like all the open worldness affects how the balancing of the game works. And if you want it balanced in your favor to the max, you're going to spend a lot of time just running around picking shit up before you actually start like engaging in the combat of the game, and that can become a problem. Anyway, another rant aside. Or you have a character that's high level like me and ignores 95% of the content. Yep. Completely agree. I get my faith build set, then proceed to let the game clap my cheeks because I'm off. Yeah. Well, I mean, like it's a game that's very impacted by the way you play it, in a way that if you play it naturally and you play it sort of naturally over and over, you'll slowly upgrade your stuff. But if you play it if you try to play it the way that you think is the most intelligent way, you're immediately going to think, oh, more healing is better. Let me go get the healing. That'll help with literally everything I do. So you run around and grab all those things, or there's specific talent, like the whole thing I just laid out, right? Is when you know where stuff is, that impacts how you're going to get stuff and when you're going to get stuff.
It's an amazing feat of world design that traveling from zone to zone truly does evoke the same feeling of arriving at a new place in Dark Souls, and this is a quality that does endure after replaying the older games. With the possible exception of going from Limgrave to Caelid, I felt like I had achieved something or marked the new stage of my adventure when I arrived at a new place. More than that, most zones manage to have that same unveiling moment of wonder that new places in this series have, like stepping out from the catacombs in Dark Souls 3 to Gawk at Irithyll, the greeting the DLC areas give you in Dark Souls 2, the palace near the end of Sekiro, and Orlando in Dark Souls 1, and if you've played these games, you know I can keep going. Despite being open world and giving you tremendous freedom to go anywhere you want at the start, to the extent that there are only a handful of regions that you can't get to within an hour if you know what you're doing, the game still manages to make you stop and stare with these moments of grand reveal. Seeing Liurnia for the first time via the hidden path around Stormvale or after beating Godric, cresting this hill with a strategically placed wall so you get to see more of Caelid all at once when you hop over it, or the confusion and wonderful dread you may feel if you get teleported here via an alternative route, which is something that can happen for a few more areas too. These are also carefully planned moments that you could have instead. The capital has the dragon corpse to wow you and still doesn't ruin your first time seeing the place from a distance. The faraway introduction you could have for crumbling Farah Missoula might actually be a better holy shit moment than the main quest way that you arrive here. Seeing the grand lift for the first time, witnessing the capital, and then finding another lift later, and the game keeps going through a mist that clears to even more gorgeous real-time landscape paintings. Dungeon areas can elicit that fundamental Souls feeling too of getting through one stage, conquering a boss, and then having that victory trot area of spindly skeletal connection that borders on nonsense but still bridges the gap to the next stage of the zone, all the while making sense in the context of the open world around it. Yes, parts of the open world are empty and not always successful, but within this world there is still a bigger Dark Souls game of traditional levels and overlapping interlinked connections than in the others. This really is 2 or 3 games in one.
Are you good and prepared, young chum?
I mean, I'd agree with
The
everything you're saying right there. It's just,
begin.
this is probably the peak from software design in terms of the actual levels themselves. Now, the content within, we can talk about, but like in terms of how much they managed to put in terms of levels to explore, this is king, right? Just in terms of design and in terms of just the number of places to go. It's really, really well made. And this is a little bit of spoilers for my video. This might be the number one thing that I put on my top 5 best aspects of Elden Ring. It's definitely going to be up there because it is undoubtedly one of the best parts of the game, just the overall package of the level design.
The underground is largely responsible for that. For me, this was the best part of the game. It's also the most creative and is the first time that From has returned to the high world design standard they set in the first half of Dark Souls 1. I can't believe that I can say that. Every single time I went to the underground, I was floored, either by the unexpected cavernous night sky, or the size of the place, or how it linked together with other areas, or the method at which I arrived. 2 surprise elevator rides can get you there, or breaking through a wall after descending through the sewers in the capital, or hell, even the modest, and on paper, kind of boring teleport stone in the consecrated grounds had me happy because I had no idea there was more underground to even find, never mind that I was going to suddenly be plopped into it. The best of these was the change that happens to the world after beating Star Scourge Radahn. You're shown this odd cinematic of a meteor crashing somewhere, and at some point later, as you're riding around, you'll see the results of that impact. Let me set the stage here. At this point in my playthrough, I had already been to the underground twice. both times through the elevator entrances in Limgrave and Liurnia. I knew from what I had seen in this location that I would find a way back down there eventually, but I wasn't sure if I would be able to reach some of the high places I had seen during my CO for river exploration. This newly formed path took me down there, with 3 separate sections to explore with 3 bosses, and a creative link back down to the lower section of this zone. Then I found a coffin transport system that I knew was going to take me to that section I had seen earlier when I was underneath Liurnia. Radon's meteor was the key for unlocking what I had seen before. And then the coffin took me to a brand new 3rd location of the underground instead. This kept going. There were 2 more coffins and transitions on this journey that all ended with one of the coolest looking bosses in the game and a mysterious blocked path that I couldn't get through for dozens of more hours, and then solved another separate long-standing mystery I had when I finally did. For this entire stretch, Elden Ring was a 12 out of 10 for me. For a few hours, I felt like I was playing the best parts of Dark Souls 1 again. I never expected that From would ever pull that off and do something that could get me back to that feeling. There was a toxic swamp in this part, or Scarlet Rot as it's called in Elden Ring, and I enjoyed it. It was super poison, and I didn't care. Elden Ring is so good, it made me like poison swamps again, was almost the title of this video. 40 hours later, I would find another underground location through that teleport, and
This is the one thing, right? I'm kind of letting some of this play just because I don't. If he says something odd that's not really a point, you know, like that little bit about the toxic swamp thing being a title and stuff like that, I'm probably not going to pause on that just because there's no real point to that. It's just kind of a okay, that's you do you kind of a thing. I'd like to get through this video and not go through it in like 2 months, but at the same time, like I kind of agree largely with what a lot of what he's saying here. You know, it's just the game does give you that kind of explorative energy throughout most of it, where you just keep finding new places to go, and that's a really good thing.
another entrance to a part that I had already explored. My only disappointment with the size of this game is that the underground map doesn't fill in the gaps of the spaces it has with the world above, even if it was with just small pocket zones that are self-contained. It's a selfish, unreasonable disappointment though, because the amount of stuff to do here is on par with Hollow Knight in terms of being a bargain. Elden Ring is a full price AAA game, and it's still somehow launched permanently on sale. The majority of these underground sections felt like the equivalent of the looser, more freeform levels found in From's Souls games. So for me, they're legacy zones. Legacy in this case being the word that's been settled on for labeling areas in Elden Ring that are traditional Souls stuff and not a part of the open world. There are small side dungeons in this game in the form of catacombs and caves, but those aren't legacy dungeons like Stormvale Castle and the Academy of Raya Lucaria. Let's complain about Nintendo for a bit, because what would a Joseph Anderson video be without that? I hope Elden Ring will be the game that redeems my Breath of the Wild criticism for most of the people that didn't agree with it. Because nothing proves it more than thinking about how much lesser an experience Elden Ring would be if these legacy dungeons were removed. The side, shrine-like mini-dungeons you can find would be all there is for a quick flash of a Souls-like experience. Sometimes it's hard to imagine the addition of something and how it would work, but it's usually...
So what is he saying? No, for any new watchers, Nintendo is notorious about copyright claiming footage used on YouTube. Oh, okay, that explains some of it then. They claim to be more friendly about it now, but I'm not risking it for a 10 to 20 seconds throughout the whole of this video, so enjoy the Skyrim stand-in and these premiere clips from my Breath of the Wild video. Thanks, Nintendo. Okay, so that gives me a little bit of context, right? I knew Nintendo were assholes for copyright, but I didn't know they could go that far. I'm going to pull my hair out if he says Zelda again. Okay, it makes sense why he's hiding the clips now. It makes sense now. So I retract that complaint of making weird things. I know that they were bad, but I didn't know they were this bad. But anyway, what he is talking about, though, about taking out some of the dungeons and stuff, is like if you take out the dungeons, you do... like the dungeons, if you take out the dungeons, you don't actually lose that much in each area. Like there's still a lot of stuff on top of them, you know, between like actual caves and the gals or gales, or however you say them. You should have put this earlier, to be honest. Yeah, that's true. But damn, Fangaris, you were crapping on him for the Zelda clips. Shame on you. I know. I feel bad now. I apologize. I officially retract me being stupid. But yeah, what he's talking about, like removing dungeons, it's like there's still, you know, there's still a lot of stuff to do if you like remove the dungeon specifically. But anyway, we're making decent progress.
Easier to imagine if something was taken away. Do this to Elden Ring, and maybe you can understand why Breath of the Wild was such a letdown in this way. If this had happened, this video would be entitled Elden Ring, Not Enough Dark Souls. Time will tell how good these legacy dungeons hold up compared to the greatest hits of the series. I know already, however, that Stormville Castle, Crumbling Far Missoula, Lindell, and its sewers will be contenders for the top. These dungeons are huge, sprawling, and complicated to navigate.
I don't know why it calls them dungeons. That's like we have actual like dungeons, right? And like I just call these like castles, right, or just cities because that's what they are. Like this is a castle. It's like, why not call them castles to differentiate them from the dungeons, right? Like his terminology is kind of confusing.
With secrets and shortcuts and multiple overlapping links that reward experimentation and studying how the geometry of the areas you can reach fits together. There are secrets I know I still haven't found in these places because I can see items I haven't been able to loot yet. Far Missoula may be more impressive visually, but its placement in the world means it doesn't have the same achievement that Stormvale and Lindell do by fitting naturally into the open world around them and still feeling like expansive Dark Souls levels, both with entrances and exits that make sense and bridge the player between two open world zones. And you can see it all from the outside as you ride around too. Simply a stunning achievement in game design. In summary, the open world successes are
Never gotten people saying legacy dungeons like it's part of the game. Like it's it's like I don't know why he say legacy dungeons. I mean, if you want to compare things, I mean the dungeons are more like the Chalice dungeons from Bloodborne than they are from anything from Dark Souls. You know, if anything, I'd say they're Chalice dungeons done right. You know, you don't have to farm them; you just have to reach them, and then you can go through them. Now, I do have complaints about them, right? I don't like a lot of the enemies, and I don't like the way they kind of limit your encounter, where you have to go through them without warping anywhere. I think the warping like thing is a ridiculous restriction, but you know they pretty much work as the Bloodborne catacomb dungeons, or not catacomb dungeons, but the Chalice dungeons.
and how it captures that feeling of seeing something so majestic in scale in the distance and then actually being able to go there. In my Ring City review, I lamented that the game showed me a gorgeous city in the distance and then kept me from it, kept me isolated in one path and used that city as a background to it all. If Elden Ring
That's unfair to Dark Souls 3. You actually go through the city, and you can go through a couple of alternating paths that lead you to things, namely Lap's quest line. Although I will concede that them teasing a city and then you not being able to go through it is kind of a bait and switch in a way, but you can still go through a little bit of it, right? And this is one thing that I think Elden Ring does really well is it'll show you a castle or a city or something, and you'll actually be able to go through it, right? Like the Halig Tree is probably my favorite level that From Software has ever made because of that fucker being so just dense in terms of where things are both vertically and horizontally. Like it's just like the Halig Tree is crazy good from like a level design perspective. Granted, it's extremely linear, right, for the most part, but it's still really well made, in terms of just how everything connects together and how it leads you down and down and down and down. You start at the very, like, not the very top, but like the top of it, and you slowly make your way down, circling over and over and over and over and over until you get to Melania at the bottom, right? And it's a really good level design for that sort of linearity, along with a lot of looping passages that lead you through shortcuts in different areas to grab various items and things. Now, the balancing of that area is a problem, but like the level design is pretty top notch. Only Acer uses them to the point of warring him out of them so he wouldn't cover in his video. Yeah, I remember Acer barely talking about them, which I was surprised he did. He talked about a lot of things in that game that didn't need to be talked about and didn't talk about a lot of things that needed to be talked about. It was disappointing.
shows you something, it lets you go there, and with only a few compromises and empty sections in its world, still feels true to its soul's roots. I don't know how they pulled this off and made it look so good when Dark Souls 3 still suffers from horrible LOD issues today, after receiving several patches trying to fix it too. You'd also be reasonable in thinking that another part of From's magic wouldn't survive the transfer to this new format, specially designed and focused guaranteed experiences. These aren't always flashy, and that just goes to prove how purposeful they are and how hard they hit. Remember, this is a series in which one of the most famous and riveting moments that virtually everyone has when they play is kicking down a ladder after crossing a bridge. There's a dragon involved in this scenario, and yet the ladder stands out more. How can an open world facilitate that kind of thing? Well, this is why the game can't be played more than once to full effect. Elden Ring expertly uses funneling systems with connections between zones and boss fights, and
Of course, Joseph isn't writing torrent optimally. Yeah, he's not using the optimal healing method either of finding that one talisman that restores health every couple of hits. Just it's good. Even when we're free of Acer, he still haunts us in our memories.
returning to dungeons having one main entrance to still provide these singular experiences. And in the case that there is an alternative path or route, that also has been made to be an equally powerful moment. Just like Hollow Knight could use its many entrances and exits to some areas effectively, but still differently, depending on the path you ended up taking. Whether you climb the cave route between Liurnia and Altus, or gather the two halves of the Grand Lift Medallion and have that as your welcome, you are having a memorable part of your journey that will sit as a milestone. There's even a third, weirder way to get here too. A game about revelations and information like this, how the world works and looks and fits together, cannot be done twice. Dark Souls is like this with its clicking together of the world and how you make a map of it in your head as you're on your adventure. Bloodborne has this a bit too, but also has a point where the curtain is peeled back and you're shown things that were there all along and just couldn't see.
I'm a witcher.
Consider that for Elden Ring, some of your favorite moments on your first playthrough may end up being tedious your second or third time.
And I would agree with that point. Yeah, it's like things that are cool for exploration purposes oftentimes become tedious once you know what's happening, especially if they don't put anything in between for you to actually like do. I use the optimal Acer thing so much. It's so good. It's a really good meme just to dunk on him. Optimal healing just popped in my head. Need those life gems. Yes. Yes.
The wonderment you felt while the elevator ride took 5 times longer than you expected may turn to impatience and boredom when you return to Seofor River. Replay value isn't the most important metric to judge a game for me. I don't know how most people feel about it, but I think there's some consensus that the first playthrough of a game is the most important one. In From
I disagree. I think the second playthrough is the most important one because when you know everything's there, the game has to grip you, right? Like if a game like mechanically is not fun to play, right, then people aren't going to replay it, which means that your game's going to die very quickly. It's not going to have a very long lifespan, right? And that's the thing that these games don't do. Like these things keep you with the mechanics of actually playing them, right, and fighting the bosses with the different builds and all the different weapons and shit like that, right? The repeat aspect is a very big part of why these games persist for so long in so many people's minds, because you can play them a lot of different ways over and over and over, you know, through a myriad of options, right? Just a lot of different, there are a lot of different playthroughs you can have with all of these games based on your build, based on the weapon choices you make, based on how you level, based on how you choose to progress, right? Like there's a lot of options that let you play the game kind of how you want to. And if you want to do hybrid builds, you can do that too. Like there's a lot of reasons to replay these games, right? Whereas a lot of other games kind of fall apart. Like there's no real point to replay a game like Outlast, for example, because it's the same shit over and over and over and over. Go to an area, avoid a couple dudes, get grabbed, and have some spooky thing jump out in front of your face. Repeat for 6 hours, right? Like there's nothing to come back to in that game. Like there's nothing to come back to, like unless you just really want the documents in the game, right? Other than that, there's nothing mechanically engaging besides run away and parkour, like some places, right? There's no replay value. Whereas with these games, there's a lot of replay value based on everything I just said with all the different builds and the ways you can play and all the weapons and shit.
From's other games, replayability came from doing different builds and the fun of fighting the bosses again, which could be a test of skill that you can repeat or enjoy the expression of mastery. Even in Sekiro, which is arguably the least replayable of the set of games due to it only having one weapon type, you can enjoy struggling on boss fights multiple times and then
only having one weapon type. I mean, you can still like spec in different things. Like it has like the talent tree thing, which lets you do different abilities, which impacts how you play the game. I don't know. Just the way he says things sometimes like bugs me.
Games due to it only having one weapon type, you can enjoy struggling on boss fights multiple times and then enjoy feeling like a god when they become effortless. Not that I've ever had that because I'm not very good at Sekiro. Some of this applies to Elden Ring, but because of how the content is distributed, I'd argue that in many ways this game is the least replayable in the series, despite having the most possible build diversity. It's like the opposite direction of Sekiro. There they double down on combat complexity with one honed moveset, with additional complementary choices and a guided difficulty curve, whereas in Elden Ring you can do dozens of things for fights and tackle so much of it in any order. In that respect, the game is very undeniably replayable. In every other respect, it's time to get negative. My 5 big Shibiri gripes with Elden Ring in ascending order of importance are poor exploration rewards, boring shrine dungeons, recycled content, level balancing, and From's new boss design.
Wow, we get it all laid out right here. His biggest problems, right? Late game boss design, level balancing, and open world, some recycled content, boring shrine style dungeons, poor exploration rewards. Yep, these are all things that I think are going to be interesting to get into. But I've really got to pee, so I'm gonna be right back. I promise I'll be back soon. Just give me a moment. I really have to use the bathroom. BRB. All right, I'm back, and I'm ready to go. So, without further ado, let's see what he has to say. I'm assuming he's going in the order from bottom to top. I'm assuming he's going like, because a lot of bosses and stuff pop up near the end of the video. So let's see how far we can get into this.
Philosophy, aka combat changes. As always with the big game critiques, this is going to be difficult to clearly go through as many of these issues are connected, sometimes in surprising, unexpected ways. That's Elden Ring for you. Each of the 5 things on this list is a problem that is much worse when you play the game again. When you don't know what you're going to get from a side dungeon, both from the content you fight through and the reward at the end, it's easy to happily cycle through it and not mind as much. There's also the fun of discovering one of these places which aren't usually broadcast to you. There are some markers and hints to help you find catacombs and caves, but many of them are found by ramming yourself into the crevices of the map and seeing a doorway. While the content and combat is fresh, you may also not mind as much that these are on the simple side, or you may not have the knowledge that the rooms, enemies, and bosses you find in these are elements of the game you are going to be seeing again and again and again. The first ulcerated tree spirit you fight, whether as a secret in Stormvale Castle or in the Stone Sword dungeon off the tutorial area, can be an enjoyable boss encounter, especially if it's acting as the conclusion of a dungeon you just struggled through. But there are at least 10 more of these in the game to fight, just like the initially mysterious tree guardians in the world outside. You're going to be fighting this boss a lot until it's not a boss anymore. So the script writing gods have decided this is the first of 5 we're sinking into then. Recycled content.
Okay, so he's going in a random order. That's a bit weird. But yeah, recycled content is definitely an Elden Ring problem, where they just take an enemy that you either have fought already and repeat them, or take an enemy from somewhere else and just make them into a boss. I mean, the Farum Azula dude that's in the cave right next to the Tree Sentinel in Limgrave, he's just like a dude in Farum Azula, just like several other Farum Azula bots. I keep saying bots, but Farum Azula dudes. It's just like they take enemies and then make them. And this is one thing, right? It's like, but they did this in Dark Souls 1. It's like they took demons and had a couple of them appear elsewhere, and then they were all in one particular area, right? These tree things are all over the place. The Farum Azula guys are all over the place. The Crystalians are all over the place. These enemies are just being repeated over and over and over. It's no longer like a contextual thing where maybe 1 or 2 made it to the surface and the rest of them are down in hell, right? They're everywhere. Like they get everywhere. Not to mention when they repeat like unique enemies, like the Godskin Noble or Apostle, right? Like just you repeat those guys in various areas at different points. It's like, it's just the repetition of assets make the pads the runtime of the game without adding anything new, right? And that's the laziest kind of design, right? It's just taking something, copy and pasting it somewhere else just to say you have an extra boss, right? But now it's higher level or something, right? It's just lazy. And in a game this size, I can understand why you would repeat assets, but at the same time, when you repeat assets that are already bosses multiple times on top of them being bosses, right, that just gets old, right? Like, think about the last time that you encounter the Godskin duo, right? How many times do you fight them beforehand? You can fight the fat boy on while you're traversing the Divine Tower of Liurnia. You fight the skinny dude in Altus Plateau. All right. You can fight Fat Boy in Volcano Manor again. You can fight Skinny Dude at the bottom of the Kaled Divine Tower again. You fight the 2 of them in that one dungeon. I forget exactly where it is, but you fight both of them slowly over time. You fight one, then you fight the other, then you fight the little snail dude. Right. So by that point, you've encountered each of these enemies on an individual basis 3 times just within those 5 encounters, right? So by the time you get to the Godskin duo as an actual boss fight, like in Farum Azula, you've already fought them 3 times apiece, right? But now you fight both of them at the same time, and they respawn, so you're probably killing them an additional 2 times on top of the 2 that initially spawn in that fight, you're just repeating the same shit over and over and over, right? Like you're not giving me anything new. You're just cranking their health and damage each time. It's just lazy. There's no other way. There's no other word for it. It's just lazy. I mean, even if you had the same enemy as a boss over and over, that was like a minor, like kind of like how mini bosses were treated in Dark Souls 1, right? Or in Dark Souls 3 or Dark Souls 2, like even, the mini bosses of those games, right? Like mini bosses in Dark Souls 1, Black Knights, the boars, the like armored boars, right? It's like those things like were rare and they were tough, like in here you could probably do something with those Erdtree guard dudes, the ones with the horn shield and those ones. Now granted, I don't like those enemies, but you could reasonably appropriate them as bosses and reuse them over and over and give some lore reason why they're everywhere. Like they're scouring the world for whatever, but just having like a random Farum Azula beast here, then another pair of them here, then another pair of them here, then maybe 3 Crystallians here, 2 Crystallians here, 1 Crystallian here. It's like you're just repeating assets in a way that you think is scalable for balance sake when you're just taking enemies and just copy and pasting them in different areas. They might be different types of that enemy, but it's still that enemy that's a regular enemy somewhere else in the game. It's just lazy copy and pasting. And you just number crunch it and say, okay, now it's balanced. Let's move on. I have to concede that the way they placed the demons in Demon Ruins was awful. And Garrus, you're being a meanie. I don't think the Demon Ruins, the way they play now, placing the demons in the Demon Ruins makes sense. The way they stuffed it full of demons is a problem. There are a fuck ton of Capras and Taurus demons down there, and you kind of have to go through the Capras. At least you can ignore the Taurus demons, but like all those Capras does become a bit of a clusterfuck. Again, one of the problems Dark Souls 1 has. Still a great game, but that is a problem.
Content is present in all of From's games. In fact, they usually use it quite well, especially in the finale areas where you return to another piece of one of the early zones to explore it with newly powered up versions of early enemies, showing you that while stats and power levels can matter, movesets and dealing with them are the true test of dominating opponents. It's also common that early bosses will return later in the game as regular encounters, both to show you how far you've come in capability as a player, but also because late game enemies with their more complex fight mechanics fit quite well as an easy to implement early boss. This issue is specific to Elden Ring in that not every choice for an early boss was a good one, and that some of the bigger fights also come back in a way that ruins the event level status of the first time. The Taurus and Capra demons don't have this issue for a few reasons. They're more understated, unexpected boss fights in that game, aren't the most bombastic enemies in Dark Souls 1, and also feel like monsters that wandered up through the world from late game areas. Imagine if you fought multiple gaping dragons or multiple Quelags, and I think the point is made. There's a difference here between the big wow, this sure is an event bosses and the others.
That's something I kind of would agree with. Like, imagine if you fought, a very unique enemy type several times throughout a game. It kind of cheapens their uniqueness. Like imagine if you fought 4 Nitos, right? Imagine if you, or better yet, let's just use Elden Ring content specifically. Imagine if you fought, for instance, 2 Radons, or 3 Radons, or 5 Radons, or 10 Radons. You like Radon, don't you? How about we put 20 in the next game? It's that kind of cheap shit where they're just taking content and spreading it. Even if people like the boss the first time, that doesn't mean they're going to like it the 5th time, or the 6th time, or the 10th time, or the 20th time. Like it gets old. I don't mind the reuse at all. It makes perfect sense and is actually a good showcase of your power growth, which is true. Talk about Dark Souls 1 demons. Just spamming the demons in clusters wasn't good though. Yeah, getting back to like Elden Ring is like this is a point I completely agree with him on. It's like they just they're turning the event status of a boss and just making them kind of a basic bitch that you're going to fight later on as just a regular enemy. I mean, it's also like the difference between the Capra and Taurus demon fights in Dark Souls 1 as well is that they're still formidable opponents, right? Like whether they are a boss or just a regular enemy in an area later on in the game, like they still pack a wallop, right? They still deal a lot of damage, have a lot of health, have very hard hitting attacks. They're still encounters. Whereas, like, you take the Beastmen, right, from Farum Azula, you can stun lock the fuck out of them with several weapons, right? It's not like a boss as much as they just took a enemy that you can slap to death, like most enemies in the game, and then just gave them a boss health bar. That's pretty much it. Like, they didn't really change it to make it more interesting as a boss fight. It's just an enemy that gets a little bit of extra highlighting. Whereas the Taurus and the Capra can actually feel like boss fights because they actually are significant threats.
Consider that of the first 3 zones, Limgrave, including the Weeping Peninsula, Liurnia, and Caelid, that there are only 2 unique boss fights, Renala in the Academy and Radon on the coast of Caelid. Margit comes back twice later, and even Godric, which is my favorite boss in the game, is repeated casually in an Everjail somewhere in the Altus Plateau. There are about 80 bosses spread over these 3 zones, and only 2 remain unique. For the total game, that number comes in over 150, and maybe close to 200 if you consider that some encounters with enemies without title health bars could still be a boss. The total unique fights among these is around 10, depending on if you think stuff like the Grail Mercy Kill is a unique encounter. Not all reuse is bad, of course, and some bosses also come back later with an enhanced moveset or a different soft phase change, so the amount of unique boss content is a little tricky to gauge, but still on the low side considering the size of the game, in my opinion. This doesn't bother me that much, and in some cases I even like it because enemies like the Crucible Knights are fun to duel against, but there is a distinct lack of event-level encounters in the game as a whole, and the recycling doesn't stop there. In fact, it transcends both the enemies and the limits of this game. An odd thing I love about Elden Ring is how artificial the world feels in a deliberate way, not in a it's obvious this is a game way. The lands between feel like a ring world, like the type from Halo. At the edges of many cliffs, you can see that the natural stone is being worn away to reveal ruins underneath. Couple this with the revelation of the eternal cities and deeper ruins in the underworld, and you get the impression that these constructs are the actual real base of this place, and all of the natural land is like a growth on top of it that can be worn away in parts. I don't know if that's the intent, but that's how it felt to me. The contemporary settlements we visit in this game are built on artificial land over the top of older ruins that are stacked on even older ruins, as if there's a constructed engine and support palaces with stonework struts through the entire world. It's ruins all the way down. This actually fits quite well with the other impression I get from Elden Ring and how it relates to other From games. This is like Dark Souls Afterlife. Whereas Dark Souls 3 ended with an entropic big crunch and grinding to ash, Elden Ring is like another Big Bang version of this universe, and is where all the entities you have slain ended up after you played those games, and some of them have gone through some sort of corrupted evolution. I'm sorry if any of you have been annoyed that I keep calling this back to Dark Souls when it's not in the name of the game, but the identity of that series runs deep in Elden Ring, not just in tone and themes, but also in actual content. Many weapons and animations and enemies are reused, and some weren't even reskinned from those games. For some that were, it took me too long to realize the Tree Guardians are Asylum demons, and that the little gargoyles in the catacombs are the small hat ambushers from Dark Souls 3. I'm not saying that this is a bad thing in every case, or that these games are chronologically linked and actually exist in the same universe, although that could possibly be the case, I guess, only that they share much of the same DNA. The unceremonious placement of the shrine dungeons feeds off this.
All right. I mean, a lot of that stuff he just said is like, yep, totally agree. Like he's got some takes that the way he words them might be odd to me, but I've been agreeing with all of this repetitive shit. And these, I'm curious what he means by shrine style dungeons here, but I think I know where he's going to go with this. I bet he's going to say that the dungeons don't give you enough rewards that are worthwhile because they're all very build specific, or it's just a summon of an enemy when you get like 50 different enemies that you can summon in the game, with probably less than half of them being worth it. Like the others are just absurdly weak and just a waste of FP.
Artificial feeling of the world. Then you get inside and that all melts away. The same enemies over and over, the same rooms over and over, the same elevator shafts to the point that they have the same pattern of ledges to awkwardly jump down, and a huge variance on what kind of boss you're going to get. I don't think this feature is finished, and I suspect they were meant to be randomized like Chalice dungeons, which is what they feel like right now, only worse. Chalice dungeons are a feature in Bloodborne that allowed you to use materials to spawn a procedurally generated dungeon with a boss, a locked door, a switch somewhere that opens it, a neat little bundle of rooms, sometimes even with shortcuts, and a helping of different enemy types. I liked this feature, but I didn't love it because it wasn't developed enough. It would have still been better to do this again for Elden Ring than what we got, since there is somehow more repetition in most of these caves and catacombs than what a generator could do. And that is so very true when it comes to the enemies found in these things and the layout for most caves. There are some of these that are fun, the tricky fake loop catacombs and some of the more open cave systems especially. These feel like what they were all meant to be, but they didn't have time to flesh it out, or most tragically, maybe most of these were randomly generated and they set these in stone because of loading issues or due to time constraints. And
Well, I think the simple fact of the matter with this, like in terms of like talking about these dungeons compared to the Chalice dungeons, is I think the randomization of the Chalice dungeons is a problem because they can feel very samey after a while when it just generates random enemy in random place and a random time. And the like from what I understand, the Chalice dungeons are really good for looting very specific items that are usually restricted to a one-time sort of deal, but they require a lot of materials to build up and to unlock. Whereas these are, you just reach them and then you go through them, then you fight a boss and then you get something of value, right? I think there's an argument to be made on both sides in terms of which is better in terms of what they add to the game. But I think for the sake of Elden Ring, I think these things work fine as just little dungeons that give you a little reward, either with like a talisman or like a summon or some upgrade material, right? Like I think this point he's making, I understand where he's coming from. I would argue against it, but I can totally see where he's coming from here. So I'm a little bit on the, I would argue against it, but I can totally understand where he's coming from with this.
and they just didn't randomize the enemy types enough. This hurts replayability more than anything because now you know which ones are boring, which is most of them, and so a huge swath of content that you chewed somewhat contentedly through your first time is now gone forever. Randomizing this, especially with enemy types and traps, would have gone a long way here. I hope this demonstrates well the different types of recycling and how it can be used. It's a bit difficult to wrap your mind around that not all good content makes good recycled content, and not all bad content is bad when reused.
I mean, that's one thing I would kind of agree with a little bit, but I mean, if the content is bad on the face of it, then repeating it does make it worse. It's one of those. It's one of those like semantics. Like the way you worded it makes it obvious that repeating bad content just gives you more bad content, right? Repeating good content doesn't necessarily give you more good content if it's just the same thing again. But like if you repeat content that is bad, like objectively bad, then you have just made more bad. So just a poor wording on his part for that little point.
A game full of randomized dungeons would likely be disappointing, but as a side distraction that you can literally roll the dice on what you get, while also providing a fun and always guaranteed to be new dungeon with the great combat base of the game, is something that appeals to me, because that's why I liked the Chalice dungeons. Meanwhile, the best bosses in the series would be greatly diminished by coming back later because it dilutes the first experience. A rematch in a menu is great and should always be included in these games, but when it's the same fight serving as the climax of another area, again, it makes both the current rematch and the first round take a hit in quality. The ulcerated tree beast is no longer a cool encounter that topped the place off with a memorable fight, it's now a routine. And the absolute best example of this, which I hope will resonate with most of you watching, are the open world dragon fights.
Yes, I hate the open world dragon fights are some of the worst fights in the game just because of how repetitive they are. It's just it's just dragon that deals different type of damage. Maybe has a status effect and health and damage are cranked. It's the same shit over and over, and it's a really boring fight anyway. Just because the best place to hit them is their head, but their head's off the ground most of the time, so you can't hardly hit them. And when they're attacking with their head or their claws, you can't hit their head very well. So you're better off to run to their legs and just smack at them, which they take reduced damage at the legs. So it's like, what the fuck? You just made this encounter tedious and boring.
This encounter with the dragon in the swamp was one of the most amazing moments I had in the first few hours with the game. This felt like something out of a movie. I was a knight on a steed galloping through the fire and the flames to get at the huge monster and stab it in the face. There was a great back and forth of taking a hit, returning a hit, getting knocked off my horse, then calling it again to ride back into battle in a way that made a dragon flying away feel awesome instead of tedious. From has always had this issue with dragon fights. Their aerial attacks become boring because of how limited your mobility is in comparison to them, and here's Elden Ring telling you, nope, go get him, Tiger. The boss was amazing and is in my top 5 bosses of all time for the experience it provided, is what I would like to be able to say. Because the game ruined this by making me fight what feels like dozens of these, just over and over with the same dragon fight that was always identical except for the element of its breath attack, which meant I understandably gained familiarity with how it worked, learned the exploits of its AI like you have to do with all of the giant enemies that don't fit on the screen in these games, and just like that, these were boring. And so the first fight retroactively became boring as well. The later larger dragons they introduce and then spam you with in Crumbling Far Missoula were even worse. It feels like you're meant to attack their heads because their body takes less damage, but they move so erratically that I couldn't do that reliably like I could with Midir. So this became an awkward foot stomping contest while I rolled when I thought I needed to because of attacks I couldn't see. This is
all those effects with the dragons, like the dragons in Elden Ring are largely terrible, because of shit like that, where the smaller ones just fight the exact same way 90% of the time, depending on the elemental type of damage they deal. Like it slightly gets changed up whenever you have like a rot one or a magic one or a frost one or whatever, but they're still very tediously fought. And then the Farum Azula ones are much bigger, much stronger, and they AoE spam a lot more, with lightning waves going everywhere. It's just like a lot of the same fights with the same problems all over the place, and they have several attacks that just waste your time because they move away so fast from you that you'll get one hit in, they'll do their thing while you're dodging away or trying to run back to them without getting hit, and then you end up just getting enough time to get like 1 or 2 hits in, and then you have to go through the whole process again of avoiding all their crazy shit before you can attack them again. That slow it just makes the combat slow, just because you spend so much time dodging all these big attacks and big AoE moves that have elemental damage. It makes every fight tedious with dragons. The exceptions to that, I would say, would be the special dragons, i.e., Baal, Placidusax, and Fortisax, right? Like they are unique dragon fights. And they are unique dragon fights because they fight different. Like they're not a copy and paste, right? They're a different type of dragon. I will give that to Baal. He is a very unique fight. Granted, I don't think he's a good one, but he's still a unique fight as a dragon. He doesn't fight the same way that Placidusax fight, and neither of them fight the same way that Fortisax fights, right? Like they fight differently, but a lot of the other dragons are just very repetitive, and that does get really boring, even on a single playthrough. Yeah, not to mention the super special ones like Exyx and Borealis were exceptionally horrible. Like, no way they fight these themselves. You called Baal unique? I knew you loved him, you tsundere. Oh, he's very unique, but it's similarly to, the way that Dark Lurker is unique. Dark Lurker is unique, but also very annoying. I'm curious what he's about to say about the fire giant, though, because he is showing him right now.
This is a trend with the giants as well, and most annoyingly, the fights against Radahn and the final boss of Elden Ring. It's amazing how the game would be improved by removing a bunch of dragons. They wouldn't even have to be replaced with anything either. Take something out, and it's a better experience. Cool thought. How long are my Witcher videos again? Outside of bosses, there are also repeating patterns found in the world. While encampments are remarkably similar to each other, they are passable to me for the enemy variety they have, as do the roaming giant pulled carriages, that I was so certain would have one become a huge mimic at some point, but it sadly never happened. The ruins are the worst offenders here, with the same type of buildings, arrangement, hidden chests, and descending stairs to a treasure chest or fight, and then a treasure chest. You can easily see how much of the world is devoted to these same repeating pockets of content, like the Everjails and churches, and while it's not offensively bad or anything, it does show signs that the world outgrew the ambitions that formed it. The Ghost Mariners and Deathbirds are also good examples of encounters that are awesome surprises you can stumble on your first time that don't feel special anymore after you find more of them over and over and over.
Plus, the Deathbirds just suck. I'm just going to say that now. Deathbirds are going straight into F tier for fuck off. Hate those enemies.
But that's not to say that the world is devoid of special moments. It's just that much of these stick out because of repeated exposure. In Altus, you can hear someone crying, follow the sound to a monster type you've likely never seen before, and there's no acknowledgement or reward or anything, just a memorable encounter that works wonderfully because of how weird it is. You can find a hidden village in the south of Liurnia, wonder about what happened here, then hit a suspicious pot and get half a medallion piece for some purpose you won't understand for 50 plus hours if you're taking your time. You can see a group of zombies on the coast of the Weeping Peninsula moving as a herd toward the tide, and spot the shipwrecks on the horizon that they are being called back to. The world has many moments like this, but that doesn't mean it's untarnished by the typical open world copy and paste technique of filling in an otherwise empty landscape. This reuse and recycling is also why many players who finish the game are saying it's too big. You can happily go through all the games in the series and not feel that way, and yet this one on its own can start to drag toward the end. Personally, I felt that in the final 2 areas, but not in the final legacy dungeons, which illustrates pretty clearly that it's a problem born out of repetition. The side dungeons became fewer and farther between, but also weren't evolving enough and doing new things, and the enemy variety tanks after the capital section with only 2 brand new enemies, I think, that are also similar to others you've seen already.
Yeah, and this is one thing too I would say is like the content of Elden Ring, like there is a noticeable drop off point in the content. Like after like after you defeat Morgott, the content of the game basically drops until you get to the final like boss sort of gauntlet. Or until you get to like Farum Azula, right? Because like you fight Morgott, then you go through that Forbidden Woods area, whatever it's called, in between Mountaintops of the Giants and Altus Plateau. Then you go through Mountaintops, and there's not a lot in Mountaintops, right? There's not a lot in terms of like actual like content compared to all the other zones, right? Then you defeat the Fire Giant, then you go to Farum Azula. It's one big area. There's plenty of things to kill, but it's like it's still just one big area with a couple bosses in it. And then you get to the final boss gauntlet, after defeating Malekith, and you fight, one spell spammy boss, one ground pound spammy boss, one holy spammy boss, and then another holy spammy boss, right? And that's just me being cynical because I actually like the Radigan and Elden Beast combo. I like both those fights. I don't like them together. Sorry, I should clarify that. But it's one of those things that like, there's a lot of content that just kind of like you're used to a certain level of content and then it just kind of goes away like after Altus Plateau, where there's just not nearly as much stuff. This isn't Joseph. Why is actually cooking right now? The Estelle Ryu still pisses me off. I would agree. Like, it's a very unique enemy, but having 2 of them is just like, why did you need 2? Like, why do we have 2? I mean, again, it's like repeating Radahn. It's like, why did you repeat Radahn? Why didn't you make like a new boss instead of just repurposing an old one? Why couldn't you do something unique and cool and new?
The snowy mountains before the Fire Giant show this best with enemies from Caelid being spammed all over it, which is another reuse that cheapens both instances of them, especially from a series that is known for its excellent enemy variety. These felt unique to Caelid for a reason that I think is really clear because they match the desolation of that area, but here they are again in a zone and arrangement just to fill it up that I suspect most players will feel and just ride on through. Like removing the dragons, I genuinely think this stretch of mountain would have been better with no enemies at all. One repeated idea I did like, however, which I think many will disagree with, were the chariot dungeons. I don't know why, but I kind of like these run and fight gauntlets. They weren't perfect, but they were different enough from the rest of the game, spread out quite well through the world, and still firmly on the optional side of things that I enjoyed them for some reason. This isn't just about novelty, however, since the hide-and-seek puzzles with the mage towers were awful, and I do not understand how a developer as experienced as From thought these were good enough for their most anticipated game of all time. It's perhaps the stupidest and most blatant filler in the game that just wastes all the space on the map and for many builds offers a useless upgrade on top of it.
Now, this is the one thing where this towers, I would push back on him for a little bit, right? Like, I think these puzzles are... I'd say that their gimmick does get old, but given that, I do think it is a thing where having something to break the mold of combat where you do something besides just kill things to progress, I think is a good thing to put in a game like this. You know, now granted, it does get repetitive when you have to seek 3 wise beasts like 7 times in the game to get something that gives you more spells, more spell slots, right? Like I wish what they unlocked was more useful. And personally, what I would have liked is if most of the sorcery um, stuff was locked behind these things instead of just being able to have another memory slot, right? Like I think memory slots should be tied to your stat like it was in previous games and not be locked off behind these puzzles that you have to solve. I think having these puzzles be things you have to solve should reward you with something material, not something that many builds won't use, right? I also think it makes sense, sort of, not cosmetically, but like thematically, because all these towers are often like associated with like users of magic, right? So maybe we have certain ones that are built certain ways for sorcery builds. Maybe we have certain ones that are built differently or reorganized in terms of where each of the sub areas within the towers are, and therefore more incantation stuff. You know, like you could vary these up depending on what type of build would use what type of thing, right? But because they just have a blanket thing where most of these just give you a memory slot, most people just ignore them going forward. Now, a couple of them don't give you that; they give you something else. But I think these things do serve a valuable purpose, but that purpose could have been filled by something else, and something else more useful could have been placed here instead, right? But I do think the idea of like having a puzzle to solve before you can access these things, I think it's a good thing to break up the monotony of exploring in combat. But at the same time, I don't think the rewards are what they could have been. Like I think the rewards could have been better.
Which brings us nicely to another point on the list: disappointing rewards.
It's kind of funny that I mentioned that.
With great build diversity comes great build possibilities. In its world to find, Elden Ring has a staggering amount of spells, weapons, healing upgrades, spells, shields, spells, talismans, spells, armor, consumables, upgrade materials, spells, and spells. There are weapon arts too, also known as spells. In theory, placing the majority of these around the world to find should be a good thing since they're practical, tangible rewards, but in practice, it means that every player is going to get sweet fucking nothing from most shrine dungeons, stone sword rooms, and even some of the legacy loot chests. The most disheartening moment for me was in my beloved underground stretch when I fought through a quick gauntlet in Noxtella for the big prize to be a talisman that increases spell slots for my guy who never used a single speck of magic ever. Like investing into crypto, this is simply a numbers game in which everyone loses.
I think he is kind of going hard on this though, which I think he's going hard on this because his build didn't use magic a lot, and I would say that I think he's not accounting for all builds here, which I would push back on. Like, I think some of these rewards aren't that great, but they are great given particular builds that would use them, right? And that's part of the thing that I think impacts all these sort of sub areas in the game, right? Joseph is really striking home that he hates mages like me. Yeah, like it's becoming very apparent in these clips that he doesn't use a lot of magic, or at least he didn't, because he's got this strength build. We've seen like a tanky thing. I think we've seen a couple clips of him running around as a sorcerer, or at least in the sorcerer garb, but he wasn't using spells. So I mean, and this is one thing too, is like the game gives you a metric fuck ton of spells, but at the same time, a lot of enemies can deal with your spells by having the dodge shit, which undermines the whole point of having all these spells if the enemy can just insta dodge them as soon as they release from your catalyst, right? Plus, there's such a thing as hybrid builds. Strength int exists. Yeah, and this game actually has a lot of things that help with that. But it is one of those things where I think he's kind of belaboring the point a little too harshly here in an unreasonable way, right? Like if you wanted to say that a lot of the game's builds are, if you want to say that a lot of content in the game gets forgotten unless it's relevant to your build, I could totally agree with that, because if you're playing a strength build, you don't need anything for sorcery. Now there might be some talismans that cross over between different lines, like the like the icon one that increases skills, sorceries, and incantations, right? Like that's usable for multiple builds. But if you're a strength build, you don't need the one that increases your intelligence, right? For the most part, like you don't need one that increases your incantations used if you use a giant greatsword all the time. It's like your builds don't need everything in the game. Like everything in the game shouldn't work for your build. It doesn't have to. But granted, I do think that it does cheapen the content when a lot of it doesn't gel for your build. But at the same time, it's accounting for multiple builds, right? So I think this is a thing where he's going too harshly against this point, against Elden Ring, when it's a very reasonable thing considering that there are multiple builds to be had in this game when playing. If you thought those spells looked nice, you could slap a cold infusion on that greatsword and Colossal gets stupid status buildup. Yeah, Colossal is really fun with a status buildup, as you've seen from my greatsword pokey build. But just a lot of greatsword pokey bleed build is great. But I think he is going a little too hard in this point, just because he doesn't get stuff for his build. It's like not everything has to be for your build. But at the same time, it does cheapen going to places in future playthroughs, because why go to a place if it doesn't give you something for your build and it doesn't give you a lot of runes anyway?
Scarlet brain rot that some people have contracted about build mandates in this game is something we'll speak about in the combat section, but for now, I just want to make it clear that even a theoretical perfect player who is somehow using both a slow weapon and a fast weapon with a shield and a seal or staff, like some psychopath who loves Ranny so much they want to fill up every hand slot, is still going to find the overwhelming majority of these rewards to not apply to what they're doing. You can't upgrade that many weapons or shields. Most talismans simply aren't that broadly applicable.
What? What was that point about not being able to upgrade shit?
Slot is still going to find the overwhelming majority of these rewards to not apply to what they're doing. You can't upgrade that many weapons or shields.
You can't upgrade that many weapons or shields. What are you talking about? Of course you can. Also, I've never even seen that Lance talisman. Where do you get that from? Shit. Ah, yes. Ah, yes. More underhanded mage hate by insulting Ronnie. Gotta insult the streamer. Otherwise, the Sims will remain in their beds. But, you can upgrade weapons and shields? I don't know what he's talking about here. Bell bearings after hearing that. Oh.
Talismans simply aren't that broadly applicable, and the different schools of casting require different loadouts and stat investments. And this is all before you get into the idea of committing to a type of build that appeals to you, which is what almost everyone does when they play these games. Most of this shit is a waste of time. This really diminishes the excitement of completing a dungeon after you knock out your first few, especially with the relentless stuffing of the new Ash Catch-em-all spirit Pokemon summons down your throat.
Now, this is one thing, too. He's coming from the perspective of the first playthrough being the most important one, which also informs us that all this shit for knowledge's sake, for a repeat playthrough on a different character, he's not considering, right? He's not brought it up, right? All this shit that you're going to find in the game, like if you pick up 100% of all the shit in the game, you're going to use like 20% of it. Like you're going to use less than 20%, probably less than 10%, probably less than 5%, to be honest, throughout the game. That's just because of the way that you play the game. Like you have these are options for different builds, for different hybrid builds, for different player types and for different sort of specs they want to make, right? You don't have to have the exact same thing, for everything. My man, you are in a Magic Academy. What did you expect? It's like, yeah. Like some areas are obviously, pushed more towards one thing than the other. Like the Rhea Lucaria just area in general is like stuff with magic shit. You're going to get magic shit there. It's like you're getting shit for different builds. It's kind of obvious. Your first playthrough is like your first playthrough is going to be like this for every build, because the game is built for multiple builds, which means that most of the gear in the game is not going to be for your build because there are so many builds. This is a duh moment. It's like, yes, the builds use different resources that some other builds won't need. They put them in the game this way. That doesn't mean that they're utterly useless.
It's even worse on your later playthroughs when you will now plan which dungeons are worth hitting up, like a formal strategy of which aisles you're walking down in the grocery store to get the good stuff and skip the bad as quickly as possible. This compounds with the poor nature of the shrine dungeons and, most unfortunately, Elden Ring's introduction of a horse. See, it's not just more formal loot chests and side areas that suffer here, it's also pretty much every single enemy in the open world too. While the sanctity of the Dark Souls experience may persevere in the legacy areas, the same is not true for the open world. You are flush with checkpoint grace bonfires everywhere and pumped full of fresh Crimson Estus charges from Korok beetles and refills for full clearing groups. The intent here is wonderful. Forcing players to go back to a checkpoint for more sustain would be clunky and boring when you're allowed to wander so freely, and so the usual check of mistakes versus improvement isn't necessary from the healing system here. You can also blissfully loot things while on horseback, and I hope whoever pushed for that at From gets a statue in the lobby of themselves on horseback, picking up their crown. But the most crucial things to find in the open world are almost
I do kind of like that joke. I'm not gonna lie.
always in churches and Erd tree saplings, healing charges, and healing power upgrades from the tiers. The amount of rune souls you get from normal enemies throughout most of the game is a pittance and simply not worth the effort. Rare
That's true. Like, this is one thing that I've made as kind of a problem is like, this is the one thing that I've mentioned before is like Elden Ring's balancing like reward wise is all over the place because you have overworld enemies that give like a little bit of souls, right? Then you have like the grave areas where they drop like the runes that you can pop whenever you need to, right? They give a little bit more. Then you've got like the mini bosses, right? Enemies that have probably more health, but they're not quite bosses, like the trolls or something, or like the dogs here, or like the birds here in Caelid, you know? Then you get the actual overworld bosses like the tree sentinels, the dragons, what have you. Then you get the like minor dungeons or the minor bosses, like the ones that you see in caves, in dungeons, in ruins, stuff like that. Then you get the more unique bosses that you get in particular areas, like Morgott, like the ones in the Gales, and then you get the main bosses, the ones in the main areas, Godric, Renala, Radon, Morgott, Rykard, Melania, so on, right? Like they kind of slowly tier up. The problem is that by the time you get to the second area, the average little enemy isn't going to do shit for you, right? Unless you're just really low level, right? So their value diminishes much faster than every other enemy because they are the little enemies in the world, and it's one of those things that does impact the progression of the game, because of all this shit. Placidusac's runback exists. I mean, the Placidusac's runback actually isn't that bad. It's run past 3 enemies and then drop down and then rest. So, I mean, it's not too bad.
Rare drops from these enemies really are rare and also require you to break some sort of rule and look up loot tables if you want something in particular, which I did for a shield test I wanted to perform after my 3 runs and spent over an hour killing the same guys until it dropped. The end result is that you start to ride past a lot of enemies in the world, which can bleed into a habit for running past enemies in the dungeons as well. You stop respecting the content. You could also start doing this in the previous games, but while this may just be an odd moment of hypocritical gameplay on my part, I find it a lot easier to justify exploring most of the levels in the past games because much of it is usually on the way already. And if you are intent on sprinting through content, there's a hell of a lot less you need to rush through. For some instances where I do skip, like the loop back around in Undeadburg for the crossbow, or something like the 3 tree demon monster things in the Dark Souls 3 swamp, I'm not cutting much content out, and in the inverse event that these are something that I need, they're also not that far out of the way either from the path I need to take anyway. In my opinion, the game needed more universal rewards to populate the world that could have been bundled in with the ones already in the game, especially for the shrine dungeons. These are fairly easy to suggest, so I'll just list them off. Permanent passive stat increases, which also help promote players trying some complementary build stuff like adding a spell or
I'm beginning to see why his take on the DLC would be radically different from this. He wants universal rewards, like what we got in the DLC, where they just tick up your damage and defenses. I'm beginning to see why his take on the DLC would be radically different now. It's all coming together. It's not too bad, but it's Elden Ring. Let me be lazy, game. Pretty much. Pretty much.
trialing a weapon they may otherwise not have been able to use. This would require a few balance tweaks for power and the world progression, of course, but that's already a huge issue that we'll be getting to momentarily. Clothing sets and cosmetics. Players like getting these, and I don't understand why the game is so stingy with armor in particular, and then dumps an entire set on you all at once here and there. Add a room in the roundtable hold with a bunch of mannequins that are automatically set to wear each set of armor you find, and you have yourself a hook baited for completionists to be excited about. People show off collections, can have more options to wear them too, and it's relatively easy to implement. Talisman and armor upgrade materials. This is
That last point about what he was talking about with like that last point he was talking about having mannequins and shit. It's like you can hold as many items in your inventory as you want. Like there's no point to have the mannequins. Like you can have them on you at any given time. It's just a purely cosmetic thing that they would have to design a system to make, and it's just not worth it because most people probably wouldn't use it. But it's just an odd cosmetic point for him to bring up. I didn't even think of that. LeMayo DLC damage is still wanked to high hell though. That is true, but it tells me a lot that he wanted universal upgrades, and then he got universal upgrades in the DLC. You got frostbitten by that roundtable hold NPC, Joseph, bro. What are you doing? JK. All right. Let's see what he's saying about this next little bit.
relatively easy to implement. Talisman and armor upgrade materials. This is another no-brainer, although if for some reason From doesn't want players upgrading armor anymore, they can just stick to talismans. The game kind of has this already with finding better versions of some talismans, but they're few and far between. Finding a talisman that your build doesn't want could be made exciting if every talisman came with some upgrade material, so you still get to increase the power, incrementally of course, of one you are using.
I don't think that would be a good idea, and the reason I say that is because I don't think it would help balance anything if you could get a talisman and then like upgrade it. Is at least what I think is what he's saying. But like, again, I think he's just laboring on that thing that he didn't get what he wanted from every single area of the game, so he's bitching about it. I think it's as simple as that. Like, you know, he just has to acknowledge that this game is meant for multiple builds, and there's going to be stuff in the game that inherently will not be for your build if your build is just not built to use a certain thing. That's okay. It's not bad. Hell no, if they did that, the late game would be even worse. Yeah, if they let you upgrade everything, then they'd make the end game way worse. Just because they'd assume that you've upgraded everything to the max.
Horse upgrades. Torrent is a core part of the game and sorely neglected. Not only does his dash desperately need some iframes to smooth out mounted combat, he could also have some armor to increase, some health or passive regen from a separate talisman type system for the horse, and some stamina stuff too.
That is one thing I will agree with. The fact that they introduced Torrent and then you barely have any upgrades for him until the DLC, like besides just health recovery, is just not great. Like you introduced a horse and all he does is basically carry you from point A to B faster. We'll never disagree with Joseph on this. Torrent fucking sucks. He's useful for getting from A to B, and that's about it. Like, mounted combat sucks. It's extremely tedious. Takes forever. Torrent goes down. Torrent will be the reason you die plenty of times in mounted combat because he'll go down and you'll be sitting there on your ass for like 10 fucking seconds while the enemy just comes over and slaps you again and kills you. Right? It's just mounted combat in this game is absolute ass. It is absolute ass. The only reason it's not, I mean, I would say it's one of those things that like it's barely passable, right? You can hardly do shit on Torrent besides movement. He's basically just an extra jump button. I mean, like he doesn't do much for you. And they overly punish you for falling off of him when it takes like 2 hits to knock you off. Yeah, and some bosses knock you off in 1 hit. You know, it's just that they did not give you any way to deal with combat on Torrent. So most of the time I just jump off him and just move on because there's no point. There's no point to stay on him. Like there really isn't. I can understand getting shat on if I get parried or shield broken, but Torrent is way too free for how punishing it is to fall off. Yeah. Well, it's also a thing too where he doesn't, as far as I can tell, he doesn't have any real iframes, like at all. Like even from like behind the scenes stuff that I've seen from like Zully the Witch videos, as far as I know, he doesn't have iframes. He just allows you to jump over some things sometimes. And there are some attacks that you can't jump through, like the dragons when they look at you for a little bit and then come down on you. It's like those hitboxes are basically their entire bellies. which makes mounted combat retarded when they slam down on you, knock you off your horse, and then you're sitting there for 10 seconds while they recover and start attacking you again. It's just mounted combat sucks. I mean, most mounted everything, is pretty bad for the most part. It's just there's so much that they could have done with Torrent that they didn't do, and it really bogs down mounted combat, period. He stops dead in his tracks when you get grazed, too. I damn near flawless Fire Giant one time, got tapped once, then stun locked to death. Yeah, that shit happens all the time because Torrent's poise is terrible. Like, I was recording a thing earlier where a guy, one of the lowliest enemies, a little guy with a torch, just held it out, and within like 3 or 4 hits, or the first hit me, stun locked me, second hit me, stun locked me, third hit me, stun locked me, and the fourth hit knocked me off my mount and onto my ass. That took about 3 seconds for that to happen, right? Like, Torrent needs more poise to be viable as an actual mount, because otherwise he's just extra jumping, and I'd rather just not use him most of the time. And I think a lot of players probably feel that way because he's just impossible to use sometimes. And mounted combat becomes really boring when you get rid of him because you can hardly do anything with your weapons or your spells or anything. Moving around's really annoying when you can when you can get yourself turned around, and upon turning yourself correctly back around, you'll have a bunch of problems with enemies smacking you to the ground again and then kicking your ass while you're on the ground, just laying there. Just mounted combat's just not great. LeMayo, it's even more hilarious when you're in a low-level area and it just wastes your time because unlike Torrent, you're properly geared. Oh, man, it's just so bad.
Bloodborne-style weapon gems or a new enchant system for armor would also work. This one is pretty self-explanatory, so I won't waste our time getting into it. And just to be clear, doing all of these would be overkill, but just like when I play Hunt Showdown, I'm just shotgunning to make a point. These suggestions also only work for improving your first playthrough and would actually make the game worse on later ones if it means that much of the shrine content becomes mandatory for progression power, so this would have to be coupled with some improvements and/or randomization to that content.
And there you go. He makes his own argument against his own point for what we got in the DLC. It's like when it's something that's relatively mandatory for dealing with the bullshit in the game, then you've made it mandatory where it's going to be painful to not do it. It's just, damn.
A built-in randomizer would be wonderful, actually, as another way to keep things fresh. Remember that rewards in these games are kind of like the activity you're doing on an outing with friends. Hanging out with the people you like the most in the world is the real fun you're having, but the thing you are doing, whether that's a good movie or a great restaurant, can only add to the experience. The combat and gameplay is the main part, and the reward elevates it. It's still important. Also, I realize that rune souls are already the universal reward, but they're an ever-present part of the game and don't feel special enough for a dungeon's ending. And you can also level yourself out of range of the quantities that drop from zones and the side bosses within them, whereas these alternative ideas would always be worthwhile. There's the danger here in making side content too appealing, however, and prompting the player to do so much of it that they overpower themselves for the rest of the game. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately for the sake of these proposed additions, this problem has already infected the game, and I contracted this hard. And for once, I don't think it was my fault.
Eaten from the inside by Melania's scarlet rot, his wits are long gone.
Elden Ring is open world and therefore should allow you the freedom to go anywhere you want, but in reality, it naturally keeps you in earlier zones without feeling like it's restraining you. These areas are large enough that you can explore and follow your wanderlust, drawn to whatever tickles your fancy. I did some poking around in Limgrave, beat some side bosses, and then found the mountain route around Stormvale Castle to Liurnia before beating Margit. I did a small survey of the zone, found a new sword, and then went back to kill him. I also saw a bit of Caelid before this as well, but I didn't engage with the content. By the time I was finished with Stormvale Castle and killed Godric, I was level 32 and had a +2 somber weapon. I felt about right on in terms of power level. After this, considering where this led, I did what felt natural, which was committing to a proper exploration of Liurnia. I finished the Academy dungeon there and some, but far from all, of the side content in the zone. I stumbled upon CO for River next when I returned to Limgrave, and only after finishing that did I realize that what you're actually meant to do at the beginning of the game was book it south to the Weeping Peninsula. When I went there on this run,
I mean, you don't have to. I mean, the only things that I would say that you have to do in the game are things that are stuff that, directly impact progression, like towards the goal, right? Like most people will see the lift, so most people will have to find the medallions to get up the lift. You don't have to go to the Weeping Peninsula for anything. Now there's a lot of good stuff there. A lot of upgrades, a lot of just a lot of upgrades, for lack of a better word. But it is stuff that is not necessary for completing of the game.
I was an unstoppable god that never died and killed bosses in only a few hits. I had ruined the feeling of progressing properly through this zone, which made finding all of the plentiful healing upgrades here feel very odd. And while I wish I could say that's where this sad story of poor level balancing ended, it kept going for the next 20 hours or so. It was so bizarre that after all of this, that Caelid was a walk in the park too. Aside from Dragon Barrow, of course, where I still went and killed Blackblade Kindred because I found him to be a fun fight. Godskin Apostle was another great fight here that I thought was meant to be the introduction of the Legacy Dungeon in the zone when Castle Redmane ended up being a dead end. After this, I went back to mop up what parts of Liurnia I had missed, found the next part of the underground, climbed up to Altus, and kept explosively tearing my way through content like Superman trying to open a bag of chips. If it wasn't for the dramatic spike in difficulty that occurs after finishing the capital, this would be my number one problem with the game. I deliberately tried to go where I think the game wants you to on my second and third runs, and I can confidently say that while the balance still needs tweaking, it's a lot more fun when you don't feel like you've accidentally turned on cheat mode. But I also have to add that I skipped a lot of content in those runs, so the balance still needs a lot of work, clearly. I was still feeling pretty powerful before I got into the last third of the game. My suggestions for this problem are extreme, but honestly, I don't know what else I can say. It's a fundamental problem with open world progression that no one has done properly yet. I think Skyrim is a big culprit here because it did level scaling so poorly that now other devs seem afraid to do it out of association, maybe, but an optional toggle in the menu or in Roundtable Hold to make areas scale up a little to around a few levels below you so you can still feel stronger while having some friction in fights isn't the worst idea. Scaling
That's one thing. Now he's talking about like an automatic scaling system, which would just, I mean, we kind of have seen what From Software does with an automatic scaling system with the blood vials in Bloodborne, right? Like the blood vials heal you for like a percentage of your health, not necessarily a fixed amount, right? And that's a problem with having a system like that, is that no matter how good you get, it's one of those things where like no matter how good you get at a game, the enemies will always hit you for a certain percentage or something like that based on like an option being ticked in the menu, right? And this is also a thing where like these games should not have a difficulty slider whatsoever, right? It should be the content of the game that mitigates the difficulty, not the actual like flicking of a switch. It's like, and kind of like what you're saying, Sheep, it's like, what is the point of progression if no matter what, I'm never outscaling past enemies? Yeah, it's like scaling through these games is part of the fun because you can come back to lower areas when you're upgraded and just wreck things to go where you want to. But it's that thing too where if everything scales based on an algorithm as opposed to having like hard levels and recommendations and stuff like that, you're going to run into issues of enemies that should be weak are now super strong unless the algorithm is meant to lock them to a particular level cap, at which case you may as well just leave them the level they are because you will outscale them anyway in the previous system of what we have now in the game. It's just a roundabout way of overcomplicating the process. Now, granted, I think some things are scaled really badly in Elden Ring. Some things are scaled way too high and way too low, depending on what we're talking about. But I mean, overall, the point is like the scaling matters, and replacing it with some algorithmic scaling is not going to help. Plus, you can go back with a lot more confidence and explore deeper. It builds confidence in your skill and your build. Yeah. Well, also, your resources are just better by that point because you've upgraded shit. It's just one of those things that I think he's missing, like the point of having lower level areas and higher level areas to show kind of where you've been, but also allows you to feel progression, right? Like if we played a game where the algorithm is every enemy deals 30% of your damage per hit. And that's just a straightforward algorithm. Every fight's going to feel the same if that's the damage they do. Like if they don't have a hard number in terms of what damage they actually do health wise, then it's just going to like bog down the system unless you add like a lot of variations in terms of how those attacks come through, right? And that's one of the biggest problems with this game in particular is just the way they scale numbers, right? You either scale percentages, numbers, both, or change the way the combat flows to avoid having just real cheap shit happen, where everything fights the same or deals the same amount of damage. But we've kind of run into a problem in the late game of Elden Ring and the DLC where a lot of the bosses have that problem, where just they have so much fucking damage on their side, that even reasonably leveled players are still going to have trouble dealing with certain attacks just because they deal a fucking absurd amount of damage because the scaling's off, because it's hard to predict where the scaling will be, by the time that you get to the end game. Say we incorporate Joseph's idea. At that point, why not also scale the player's stats to what FromSoft believes is appropriate? Then we'll scale your heals to what we feel is appropriate as well. Can't have you having too many flasks, right? Then your damage is scaled. Yeah, it's like you run into the issue of, like, part of the joy of these free roam games and leveling up is that leveling up is a sense of progression. Same thing with upgrading your weapons, upgrading your flask, upgrading your shield, your arsenal with arrows and ammo and spells and stuff. Like, the idea of RPGs is to upgrade your shit by leveling them up, either through like actual leveling up, through like experience points, or getting something that is the next tier up of that particular thing, right? And if you try to I'm trying to say this word, it's going to cause me to have a stroke. If you algorithmize, say that word 5 times fast. If you algorithmize stuff in a game for scaling purposes, everything's going to be scaled really awkwardly, and people aren't going to come back and be able to do as many of the niche things that people like to do in these games. Part of the fun of a lot of builds in previous games was that they would purposely not upgrade their health, get to low health purposely, use something that boosts their damage while their health is low, and then use that to their advantage because they've gotten so good at the game at that point where it's either a one-shot kill to them or they just wreck everything anyway, right? So, and that's part of the fun of the builds. If everything was scaled appropriately, or if everything was just scaled by an algorithm, all these balancing options would be off the table, and they'd have to create an algorithm for the entire game overall, or different areas, or different enemies in different areas. And by that point, you may as well just have hard caps for levels. They do this amount of health, they do this amount of damage, they have this amount of health. That's it. It's overcomplicating the process if we have to algorithmize everything. It's like it just overcomplicates the whole process if we have to make algorithms to balance everything.
Filling things down isn't necessary, I think, so you can still find areas that you're not supposed to go to yet and can challenge yourself or come back later. But when I'm incentivized and, more importantly, excited to explore so much and then punished for it by outpacing so much content, I can't help but think that something has gone horribly wrong. This issue is so bad that I also wouldn't refuse a recommended level marker on the map, or grace points, or even boss fog doors. The game is clearly meant to be hard, and that cuts both ways. Sometimes you can throw yourself at something thinking this is the intended experience since it's difficult. That's what these games are, right? And other times you don't know that you're overpowering yourself above areas you found but haven't pushed into exploring yet. The strength of the combat in the series kind of works against the format here in a way that I otherwise love. You are capable of killing pretty much anything at the beginning of the game and aren't blocked from zones until you level up enough. It does help, and you can hit some walls if you don't feel like bashing your head against it, but it's not outright impossible like it is in some other open world games, except for maybe a couple of fights that require some very specific strategies. Most open world for maybe a couple of fights impossible like it is in some other open world games.
Sorry, I had to take it back to read what he said. 1 to 5 star, here's your 5 star.
Maybe a couple of fights that require some very specific strategies. Most open world.
So what was his point with that clip? Let me back that up.
But it's not outright impossible like it is in some other open world games, except for maybe a couple of fights that require some very specific strategies. Most open world games don't have good combat, and maybe it's for this reason. The level limitation is so important that it grows to define the combat so much that it naturally erodes any skill-based intentions that the developers may have had when they originally started making the game. Elden Ring may have opened Pandora's box here by breaking this trend, since now every open world game's combat is going to be compared to it. If they could do good combat in an open world, why can't you? Literally any other developer out there. It's not fair, but that's an issue for future Joe. Anyway, this freedom also means that you can destroy level progression through the areas because the game allows you to, which I say is a failing on From's part to account for this possibility with either signposting level ranges or enemy scaling, or a better idea that exists that I can't think of because I'm not a genius game designer working at From Software.
And this is one thing too, a lot of the stuff he's asking for is just really basic bitch shit of, just like, it's like he wants a game guide to the game in the game itself, when the game will obviously tell you when you can like deal with like particular enemies in a particular area, right? Like as soon as you get to Caelid, no matter which path you take to get to Caelid, you will immediately know that the enemies are much tougher, the enemies hit much harder, and they have much more health, right? It's similarly to dealing with the skeletons in Dark Souls 1, right? Or if you try to go down to Blighttown first or New Londo Ruins first, like those enemies are way tougher than the Undead Burg enemies. Like it's pretty obvious that those enemies are pretty tough. So maybe you try another pathway, to see if that pathway if that way's easier, it's just like there's a lot of stuff here that it's one of those things where like a lot of the points he's making against the game, or a lot of the points he's making about the game are correct, but the way he wants to solve some of the problems are things where I take issue with, where a lot of the problems he's talking about, he's offering solutions that would only compound the issue. They wouldn't actually help it, and that's, I mean, like, I go back to that one comment from the stream earlier. I forget who said it, but like, it's like someone said that like he's basically a midwit trying to explain things to normies. And while I don't think he's a normie playing the game like this, I think he wants normie standards applied to this game while still having like challenge to it, which to me I think is extremely hard to actually do, because then you lose a lot of the challenge of it and you get kind of the sameness of other shit, but all right. I'm not really sure where a good stopping point for this video is, because he's not sectioned it off at all from what I can tell, and I'm gonna have to stop it at some point. So scrolled up, that was our Aborin. Okay, well thank you Aborin for that point, because I see where you're coming from, and I think it does make a lot of sense. But I do think that he's he likes the challenge of these games, and I just don't. I wonder if he understands how that challenge works, like in terms of how designing it the way it is creates that challenge, or if he's thinking of it purely from like a normie perspective of I want these things to tell me when I should go places. Like I wonder how he feels about guidance in video games, if he wants like very specific things of like, does he want a narrator saying, "You have leveled up enough. Go to Caelid. You can now handle the annoying birds." It's like, I don't think he wants that, but it sounds like he wants that, and he's doing that kind of explanation of things that he wants in that type of way, and I don't think it's conducive to improving the experience as much as just kind of downgrading stuff that you should pick up subtly by playing the game, or he's offering solutions to scaling issues that would only make the scaling even more problematic across the board, instead of just having like a couple of easy areas and a couple of really hard areas, But anyway, I'm gonna have to end this stream here. I've gone a little bit over what I had planned to do, but yeah. So we're gonna be continuing this next Saturday, and then the Saturday after next, I will be unavailable. But depending on if we get through this video, I might pre-record something. I'd really like to pre-record something on ESAS just so I can have something come up every Saturday. That way I don't take Saturday off and have nothing, because I'm really trying to keep content sort of coming. But it is a thing where I really want to. I want to try to keep the. I want to keep the sludge flowing, you know. But I also just want to keep things sort of coming out because I like doing these streams every Saturday, and I'd like to do them more consistently. It's just I've been busy with various things, but we'll see how that goes. I'd like to have maybe more one-off things that I can kind of throw up as just kind of a quick little. Here's the thing. Enjoy it while I'm away doing something. You know, I want to give you guys something while I'm unavailable, and I'm not really sure what that is because I don't want to split up like playing a video game or something, and then every other weekend that I'm off be like something video game related. You know, that's like a playthrough or something compared to reacting to a video. So I thought about making maybe like pre-recorded like minor, like smaller videos, and then throwing them up as the streamed thing. You know what I mean? But regardless, I'm gonna stop this video here. So we stopped at 46. Let's see, is that 46, 55? Yeah. Oh, wow, we got farther than I thought we did. Yeah, I'm actually surprised too. We got about halfway through this, which is pretty good, all things considered. But let's see. I need. That's not the. I've got like an Excel spreadsheet where I keep track of all this stuff, and I keep mistyping in it. Ended at 46:55. All right, so next time it would be. When is next Saturday? Next Saturday is September 7th. Okay. I should be more professional in breaking all this stuff down. But yeah, so for now, I just like to thank you all for being here, and I will announce when the Discord is ready, but once it is ready, I will take video recommendations in there. I will clearly label it somehow, still figuring out how to do it. But let's see how far we can go, and hopefully I will see you guys next Saturday. So once again, just thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next Saturday.